Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The woman who still managed the building after death. The elevator in my building makes this sound right before it reaches the 4th floor. Not a mechanical sound exactly, but something like a sigh. I never thought much about it until I realized it only happened when I was alone and only after midnight. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, when everything still made sense. I moved into the Meridian apartment 6 months ago, after my divorce was finalized. It wasn't the kind of place I'd imagined myself living at 34, but it was what I could afford on a teacher's salary, and it was mine. The building sat on the corner of Elm and 3rd, a pre-war brick structure with character, as the real estate listing had put it. What they meant was old pipes, thin walls, and radiators that clanged through the night. But the rent was reasonable, and Mrs. Chen, the building manager, had been accommodating about my credit situation. Mrs. Chen was the kind of woman who seemed to have been born middle-aged. She was probably in her 60s, though it was hard to tell. Her gray hair was always pulled back in a perfect bun, and she wore cardigans in every season, buttoned all the way up to her chin. She lived in apartment 1A, right by the mailboxes, and somehow she knew everything that happened in the building. If your delivery was late, she'd know before you did. If your neighbor was playing music too loud, she'd have spoken to them before you even picked up the phone to complain. The first time I met her, she was standing in the lobby at 7 in the morning, clipboard in hand, making notes about a water stain on the ceiling. She looked up when I walked in, and her dark eyes seemed to catalog everything about me in a single glance. "You must be David," she said, though I hadn't introduced myself. 4B, welcome to the Meridian. She handed me a manila envelope thick with papers, building rules, emergency procedures, contact information, and a detailed list of what was and wasn't allowed. No parties after 10 p.m., no smoking anywhere in the building, no pets over 20 pounds, no subletting without written permission. The list went on for 3 pages, typed in the same precise font she used for all her communications. "I run a quiet building," she told me, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never had that authority questioned. "I expect tenants to respect that." I nodded and signed where she indicated. She watched me sign each document, occasionally, making small corrections to my initials or pointing out clauses I'd missed. When I was finished, she gathered the papers with practiced efficiency and filed them in a worn leather portfolio. "Your keys," she said, handing me 2 copies of each. "Front door, mailbox, apartment, don't lose them. Replacement fees are listed on page 4 of your tenant agreement." The apartment itself was small but comfortable. 1 bedroom, a galley kitchen, and a living room with windows that faced the courtyard. The previous tenant had left behind a few pieces of furniture, a worn leather armchair, a small dining table, and a bookshelf that took up most of one wall. The floors were hardwood, scuffed but solid, and the walls were painted in a neutral beige that suggested countless previous tenants. I'd been living alone for 3 months by then, since Sarah had moved out of our house and I'd sold it in the divorce settlement. The silence was something I was still getting used to. At night, lying in the unfamiliar darkness of my new bedroom, I could hear the building settling around me. Footsteps in the apartment above, the murmur of a television through the wall, the periodic groan of pipes in the walls. It was different from the suburban quiet I'd known for 8 years, but it wasn't unpleasant. It was the sound of other people living their lives nearby, and sometimes that was comforting. Mrs. Chen left notes. This was something I learned within the first week. Not just notices taped to the mailboxes or slipped under doors, but personal communications about building life. If someone had left laundry in the machines too long, There would be a note on their door written in her careful script on cream-colored paper. If a delivery driver had left packages in the lobby instead of at the apartment door, she'd leave a note explaining proper procedure. If someone had tracked mud through the hallway, she'd leave a note about the importance of using the mat. The notes were never harsh exactly, but they carried an implicit authority that made you want to comply. She signed them all the same way. Building Management M. Chen, followed by her extension number in case of questions. I never saw anyone question them. My first note came 3 weeks after I moved in. I'd left a bag of recycling by the front door intending to take it to the bins outside, but I'd forgotten about it until the next morning. When I came home from work, there was a cream-colored paper taped to my door. Dear Mr. Peterson, it read, recycling must be placed in the designated bins in the rear courtyard, not left in the lobby. This is for sanitary and aesthetic reasons. Thank you for your cooperation. Building Management, M. Chen, Exter 101. I felt embarrassed, like a child, caught breaking a rule I should have known. I took the recycling out immediately and made sure to do it properly from then on. A few days later, I found another note on my door, but this one was different. Dear Mr. Peterson, thank you for your prompt attention to the recycling matter. Welcome to the Meridian. Building Management, M. Chen, Ext 101. It was such a small thing, but it made me feel like I belonged somewhere again. Like someone was paying attention to whether I followed the rules, whether I was part of the community. After months of feeling invisible, of living in temporary spaces and sleeping on friends' couches, it was oddly reassuring to be managed. The building had 12 apartments spread across 4 floors. I was on the 4th floor, which made me one, of only 3 tenants at the top. The elevator was old and slow, with brass fixtures that had been polished so many times they'd worn thin in places. Sometimes it would stick between floors for a few seconds, and you could hear Mrs. Chen's voice echoing up from the lobby, calling to ask if everything was all right. She seemed to know everyone's schedule. If you usually left for work at 8 and didn't emerge from your apartment until 8:30, she'd ask if everything was okay. If you typically got deliveries on Tuesdays and nothing arrived, she'd check with the postal service. If your routine changed in any way, she noticed. She's been here longer than some of the tenants have been alive. My neighbor across the hall told me one evening. Janet was a nurse who worked odd shifts at the hospital downtown. She'd lived in 4A for 7 years, and she spoke about Mrs. Chen with the kind of fond exasperation reserved for family members. She knows when you're sick before you call in sick to work, Janet continued. Last winter I had the flu, and she left homemade soup outside my door every day for a week. Never knocked, never asked for anything in return, just left it there with a note saying to drink plenty of fluids. I started paying more attention to Mrs. Chen after that. How she was. Always in the lobby when people came home from work, watering the plants or organizing the mail. How she remembered everyone's names, not just the names on the lease agreements, but the names of spouses and children and pets. How she kept track of who was traveling, who had visitors, who might need help with groceries. The building ran smoothly, under her management. Repairs were made quickly and properly. The common areas were always clean. Packages never went missing. Noise complaints were resolved before they became real problems. It was the kind of place where you felt safe leaving your door unlocked while you ran down to get your mail, where neighbors looked out for each other because Mrs. Chen had somehow created that atmosphere. I settled into a routine. Up at 6, coffee and toast while listening to the morning news, shower, dress, and out the door by 7:30 to catch the bus to school. Home by 4, unless I had meetings or parent conferences. Dinner alone while grading papers or watching something mindless on television. In bed by 10, reading until my eyes got heavy. On weekends I did laundry, grocery shopping, and tried to remember what I used to do with free time when I was married. The routine was good for me. After the chaos of the divorce, the uncertainty of where I'd live and how I'd manage on my own, there was something comforting about predictability. About knowing that Mrs. Chen would be in the lobby when I came home, that she'd nod and smile and sometimes comment on the weather or ask about my day. About knowing that my apartment would be exactly as I'd left it, that my neighbors were quiet and respectful, that nothing unexpected would disrupt the calm I was trying to build. It was mid-October when I first noticed Mrs. Chen looking tired. She was still always in the lobby, still taking notes on her clipboard, still leaving her careful communications for tenants who needed gentle correction. But there were dark circles under her eyes, and sometimes I'd see her pause in the middle of whatever she was doing, one hand pressed to her chest, breathing slowly. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked her one evening when I found her sitting on the small bench by the mailboxes, head tilted back against the wall. She opened her eyes and straightened immediately, as if embarrassed to be caught resting. "Just a little tired," she said. "It's been a busy day." But she didn't look just tired. She looked fragile in a way that made me worry. Her cardigan seemed too big for her shoulders, and her hands shook slightly as she gathered her papers. "Maybe you should take a day off," I suggested. "I'm sure the building would survive without you for 24 hours. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "This building is my responsibility," she said. "There's always something that needs attention." The next morning, there was no sign of her in the lobby. The plants were unwatered, and a small pile of mail sat unsorted on the counter by the mailboxes. I waited for a few minutes, thinking she might just be running late, but she didn't appear. When I came home from work that afternoon, the lobby looked exactly the same. The mail had grown into a larger pile, and there was a package for one of the second-floor tenants sitting by the front door. I knocked on the door of 1A, but there was no answer. I could hear the television inside, but Mrs. Chen didn't come to the door. I tried calling the building management number, but it went straight to voicemail. "This is Mrs. Chen," her recorded voice said. "If this is an emergency, please contact the maintenance service at the number posted in the lobby. Otherwise, please leave a message and I'll return your call as soon as possible." I left a message asking if she was feeling well and if there was anything I could do to help. I also mentioned the unsorted mail and the package, thinking she'd want to know. She never called back. Janet was working a double shift at the hospital, and the tenant in 4C traveled for work and was rarely home. The building felt different without Mrs. Chen's presence, less attended to. Small things started to accumulate. The lobby floor needed sweeping. One of the mailbox locks was sticking. A light bulb had burned out in the stairwell between the second and third floors. On the third day, I decided to call the maintenance service number. A man with a gravelly voice answered on the fourth ring. "Meridian Maintenance. This is Bob." "Hi. I'm a tenant in the building and I haven't seen Mrs. Chen for a few days. The lobby is starting to look like it needs attention and I'm wondering if she's okay." There was a long pause. "Mrs. Chen?" "The building manager. She lives in 1A." Another pause. "Hold on." I heard muffled conversation in the background, then Bob came back on the line. "I'm gonna have to call you back." He didn't call back that day, or the next. By the weekend, the lobby was noticeably shabby. The plants were wilting, and someone had tracked in leaves that no one had swept up. The package for the second-floor tenant was still sitting by the front door, and the pile of mail had grown large enough that some of it was sliding onto the floor. I tried knocking on Mrs. Chen's door again, pressing my ear to the wood afterward. I could still hear the television, but it sounded like the same program I'd heard days earlier. The same voices, the same background music. I realized it might be a recording playing on loop. Sunday morning, I was coming back from the coffee shop, on the corner when I saw an ambulance parked in front of the building. Two paramedics were wheeling a gurney through the lobby, and I could see Bob, the maintenance guy, talking to a police officer by the mailboxes. I waited outside until they were finished. The police officer left first, followed by the paramedics. The gurney was covered with a white sheet, and I didn't need to ask who was under it. Bob saw me waiting and walked over. He was a big man with grease under his fingernails and the tired look of someone who'd been doing physical work for decades. "You the one who called about Mrs. Chen?" he asked. I nodded. "She's been dead for 5 days," he said. "Natural causes, looks like. Heart attack, probably. TV was still on when we found her. 5 days. She'd been dead for 5 days, and I'd been walking past her door, hearing her television, assuming she was just taking some time off. The thought made me feel sick." "What happens now?" I asked. "With the building, I mean." Bob scratched his head. "Property management company's gonna have to figure that out. Mrs. Chen was more than just a building manager, from what I understand. She handled everything. Rent collection, maintenance requests, tenant relations. Gonna take them a while to sort through it all." He was right. Over the next few weeks, the building began to feel abandoned. Not literally, of course. All the tenants were still there, still going about their daily routines. But without Mrs. Chen's constant attention, small problems became bigger problems. The heat was uneven. Packages were left in the lobby for days. The mailboxes overflowed because no one was sorting and distributing mail that didn't fit. A property management company sent someone to clean out Mrs. Chen's apartment, and I watched from my window as they carried out boxes of papers and files. Everything she'd used to keep the building running smoothly. All her careful records and notes and systems. They loaded it all into a truck and drove away, taking the institutional memory of the Meridian with them. The company posted a notice in the lobby saying they were looking for a new building manager. But in the meantime, tenants should direct all concerns to their main office. The notice included a phone number and an address across town. It felt impersonal and distant, nothing like the immediate, attentive care Mrs. Chen had provided. I started having trouble sleeping. Part of it was the building itself. Without Mrs. Chen's oversight, my neighbors seemed less considerate. Someone was playing music late at night. People were leaving trash in the hallways. The building's atmosphere had changed from quiet and respectful to simply neglected, but it was more than that. I kept thinking about Mrs. Chen alone in her apartment for 5 days while the rest of us went about our lives just a few feet away. How she dedicated so much of herself to taking care of everyone else, and when she needed care, no one had even noticed she was gone. I'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and lie in bed listening to the building's sounds. They were different now, or maybe I was just paying more attention. The radiators clanged more insistently. The floors creaked in patterns I hadn't noticed before. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door, but when I looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. The elevator started making that sighing sound I mentioned earlier. It only happened when I was alone and only late at night. I'd be coming home from grading papers at the school library, or coming back from one of my increasingly frequent late-night walks around the neighborhood, and when the elevator reached the 4th floor, there would be that soft exhalation like someone letting out a breath they'd been holding. I mentioned it to Janet one evening when we ran into each other in the hallway. "I haven't noticed anything," she said, but she looked uncomfortable. Though I've been taking the stairs more often lately, the elevator feels, I don't know, different. Different was a good word for it. The elevator had always been slow and old-fashioned, but now it felt almost reluctant. Sometimes it would hesitate between floors, and sometimes it would arrive at your floor before you pressed the button, doors opening as if it had been waiting for you. The property management company finally found a new building manager in late November. His name was Rick, and he was nothing like Mrs. Chen. He was young, maybe 25, and he approached the job like any other maintenance position. He fixed what was broken, collected rent, and responded to complaints, but he didn't seem to understand that Mrs. Chen had been more than a manager. She'd been the building's nervous system, aware of everything that happened and everyone who needed attention. Rick moved into Mrs. Chen's old apartment, and I could hear him in there sometimes, playing video games late into the night. He didn't water the plants in the lobby, and they died one by one. He didn't sort the mail with Mrs. Chen's careful attention, and people started missing important deliveries. He didn't leave notes when tenants violated building policies, and gradually the meridian became louder, messier, less considerate. But the strangest thing was the notes that kept appearing. The first one showed up in early December, taped to the door of 2B. I only saw it because I was checking my mailbox when the tenant came home and found it. "What the hell is this?" he said, holding up a cream-colored piece of paper. I could see Mrs. Chen's familiar handwriting from where I stood. The same careful script, the same precise lettering. "Dear Mr. Williams," the note read, "please remember that cooking odors can be offensive to other tenants. Keep your apartment door and windows closed when preparing strong-smelling foods. Thank you for your cooperation. Building Management, M. Chen, X101." Mr. Williams had been cooking curry every night for the past week, and the smell had been drifting through the building's ventilation system. It was exactly the kind of thing Mrs. Chen would have addressed, with a polite but firm note. "Who the hell is Mzu Chen?" he asked me. "She was the old building manager," I told him. "She died a couple months ago." He stared at the note, then at me. "This is somebody's idea of a joke, right?" I didn't think it was a joke, but I didn't know what else it could be. Rick claimed he hadn't written it when Mr. Williams called to complain. He said he'd never heard of anyone leaving notes for tenants, and besides, he didn't know anything about cooking smells. More notes appeared over the following weeks. A note to the tenant in 3C about leaving wet umbrellas in the hallway. A note to someone on the second floor about their packages being left in the lobby too long. A note to Janet about her newspaper delivery blocking the mailbox area. All of them were written in Mrs. Chen's handwriting, on the same cream-colored paper she'd always used, signed the same way. Building Management, M. Chen, Ext 101. But Extension 101 had been disconnected when Mrs. Chen died. The property management company had set up a new system with different numbers. Rick was getting frustrated with the complaints. "I don't know who's writing these notes," he told me when I asked about it, "but I wish they'd stop. People keep calling me about extensions that don't exist and managers who are dead." I started paying closer attention to when the notes appeared. They always showed up overnight, taped to doors while people were sleeping. I never saw anyone delivering them, and they only appeared for tenants who had actually violated building policies. The curry cooking, the wet umbrellas, the blocked mailboxes. These were all real problems that Mrs. Chen would have addressed when she was alive. The handwriting was perfect. Not just similar to Mrs. Chen's writing, but identical. I'd kept one of the notes she'd left for me when I first moved in, the one thanking me for properly disposing of my recycling, and I compared it to the new notes that were appearing. The letter formations, the spacing, the slight rightward slant, everything matched exactly. I started staying awake at night listening for footsteps in the hallway. If someone was delivering these notes, they had to be doing it while people were asleep. But I never heard anything unusual, just the building's normal sounds, the heating system cycling on and off, the occasional car passing on the street outside, the distant hum of the refrigerator in my kitchen. On December 15th, I found a note on my own door. "Dear Mr. Peterson," it read, "you have been leaving lights on in your apartment when you go out. This is wasteful and potentially hazardous. Please be more mindful of energy consumption. Thank you for your cooperation. Building Management, M. Chen, Ext 101. She was right. I'd been leaving the living room lamp on when I went to work, partly for security, and partly because coming home to a dark apartment felt too much like the early days after my divorce. when loneliness had been a physical ache in my chest. But Mrs. Chen had always been particular about energy waste. She'd mentioned it in the building rules, and she'd left notes for other tenants about similar issues. I turned off the lamp the next morning before leaving for work, and I felt oddly guilty about having disappointed her, which was ridiculous because she was dead. But the feeling persisted anyway, the same mild shame I'd felt when I'd left my recycling in the lobby, and she'd corrected me with one of her polite notes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mrs. Chen, alone in her apartment for 5 days while her television played the same program on repeat. I thought about all the care she'd given to the building and its tenants, all the attention she'd paid to making sure everyone was comfortable and safe. I thought about how no one had paid that same attention to her when she needed it. At 2:30 in the morning, I got up to get a glass of water. As I was walking back to my bedroom, I heard the elevator. The Meridian's elevator was loud. When it moved between floors, you could hear the mechanical grinding of the cables and counterweights. When the doors opened and closed, they made a distinctive, metallic sound that carried through the building. It wasn't a sound you could miss, especially at night when everything else was quiet. I heard the elevator descending from somewhere above me. The mechanical sounds grew louder as it passed my floor, then continued down to the lobby. I heard the doors open with their familiar metallic screech, then close again. Then the elevator began to rise. It stopped at the second floor. I heard the doors open and close, but I didn't hear anyone getting on or off. The elevator continued, up to the third floor. Same thing. Doors opening and closing, but no footsteps, no voices. Then it came to my floor. I was standing in my living room, glass of water in my hand, listening to this impossible sequence of events. The elevator stopped at the fourth floor, and I heard the doors open. I waited for them to close again, but they didn't. They stayed open, and in the silence, I could hear that soft sighing sound I'd noticed before. Not mechanical, but organic, like someone breathing. I walked to my door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but I could see the elevator doors standing open, spilling light into the corridor. As I watched, the doors began to close, but slowly, as if reluctant. When they finally met, the elevator didn't descend. It just sat there at my floor waiting. After a few minutes, I heard it begin to rise again, going up to a fifth floor that didn't exist. The mechanical sounds grew fainter and fainter until they stopped altogether, somewhere above the building's roof. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I asked Rick if the elevator had been serviced recently. Serviced? He looked confused. No. Why? Is something wrong with it? It was running in the middle of the night, going up and down to all the floors. That's weird, he said. But old elevators sometimes do that. Electrical problems, maybe. I'll have someone look at it. But I knew it wasn't an electrical problem. The elevator had been making stops, opening and closing its doors at each floor, as if someone was getting on and off, as if someone was making rounds, checking on the building and its tenants. The notes continued to appear. A note about someone's music being too loud. A note about wet laundry left in the machines. A note about a guest who'd been staying too long without being added to the lease. All legitimate concerns, all written in Mrs. Chen's precise handwriting, all signed with her name and the extension number that no longer worked. Rick started leaving his own notes, printed on plain white paper and signed with his name and actual contact information. They were less polite than Mrs. Chen's notes, more like demands than requests. "Turn down your music or I'll call the cops," one of them read. "Clean up your dog's mess in the courtyard," said another. But tenants ignored Rick's notes. They crumpled them up or threw them away without reading them. Mrs. Chen's notes, though, the impossible notes from a dead woman, those they took seriously. I watched Mr. Williams throw away 3 of Rick's complaints about his cooking, but when one of Mrs. Chen's cream-colored notes appeared on his door, He stopped making curry that same night. It was as if she had more authority in death than Rick had in life. I started keeping track of the notes, making copies when I could, and writing down what I observed. The pattern was always the same. A legitimate building issue would develop. Rick would either ignore it or handle it poorly, and then one of Mrs. Chen's notes would appear, addressing the problem with her characteristic politeness and attention to detail. The tenants began talking about it, in the careful way people discuss things they can't quite explain. Janet mentioned that she'd seen Mrs. Chen in the lobby one evening, watering the plants that had died weeks ago. The tenant in 2A said he'd heard her voice in the stairwell, humming the same tune she used to hum while she worked. Someone on the 3rd floor claimed they'd smelled her perfume, a light floral scent, in the elevator. It's like she never left, Janet said to me one evening when we found ourselves checking our mail at the same time. Like she's still taking care of the building. I wanted to dismiss it as suggestion, as people seeing patterns where none existed, as the power of expectation creating experiences that weren't really there. But I couldn't, because I'd seen and heard things too. The elevator making its nightly rounds. The careful handwriting that matched Mrs. Chen's perfectly. The sound of someone sighing as if tired or frustrated when the building wasn't being properly maintained. Christmas came and went without any building decorations. Mrs. Chen had always put up a small tree in the lobby and hung lights around the mailboxes. She'd left candy canes for the children and cards for the adults. Rick did nothing, and the lobby felt stark and unwelcoming during what should have been a festive season. On New Year's Eve, I was walking home from a half-hearted celebration at a bar downtown when I saw her. She was standing in the lobby, clipboard in hand, making notes about something near the mailboxes. The same gray hair pulled back in a perfect bun, the same cardigan buttoned up to her chin. She looked exactly as she had when she was alive, except for a pale quality to her skin, as if she were lit by fluorescent light, even though the lobby's lighting was warm and yellow. I stopped on the sidewalk outside the building, key in my hand, and stared through the glass doors. She looked up from her clipboard and saw me watching. For a moment we looked at each other across the distance of the lobby and the glass and the impossible fact of her death. Then she smiled, the same polite, reserved smile she'd given me every day when I came home from work. She walked to the mailboxes and began sorting through the mail that Rick had left in a messy pile. Her movements were deliberate and familiar, checking addresses, organizing by apartment number, placing each piece in its proper box. It was exactly what she'd done every evening when she was alive, and she was doing it exactly the same way now. I stood there for 10 minutes watching her work. She never looked up again, never acknowledged my presence, just continued with her tasks as if death were simply another work schedule to maintain. When she finished with the mail, she picked up a small watering can that I was certain hadn't been there moments before and began tending to plants that had been dead for weeks. Under her attention, the plants seemed to straighten, their leaves growing less brown, their stems less brittle, not alive exactly, but not as dead as they had been. She moved from plant to plant with the same care she'd shown when she was living, talking to them in a voice too quiet for me to hear through the glass. When she finished with the plants, she walked to the elevator and pressed the call button. I could hear the mechanical sounds as it descended from whatever floor it had been waiting on. The doors opened and she stepped inside. Just before the doors closed, she looked at me again, and this time she raised her hand in a small wave. The elevator rose, stopping at each floor. On each stop, I could see the doors opening and closing through the building's windows, could imagine her stepping out to check the hallways, to make sure everything was as it should be. When the elevator reached the 4th floor, it paused longer than at the other floors, and I had the strange sense that she was looking at my apartment, making sure I was safe. Then the elevator continued up, past the 4th floor to the non-existent 5th floor, and disappeared into whatever space Mrs. Chen now occupied. I unlocked the front door and went inside. The lobby looked exactly as it had before. Wilted plants, messy mail pile, dusty surfaces. But it felt different. More attended to somehow. More cared for. The next morning, I found a note on my door. "Dear Mr. Peterson," it read, "Happy New Year. I hope this year brings you peace and healing. Thank you for being a considerate tenant. Building Management, M. Chen, Extra 101. It was the first note she'd left that wasn't a correction or a request, just a kind wish from a woman who had died 2 months earlier but was still, somehow, taking care of her building and the people who lived in it. I kept that note. I keep it still, tucked into the mirror frame in my bedroom, where I can see it every morning when I get dressed. It reminds me that someone is paying attention. Someone cares whether I'm following the rules and treating my neighbors with respect. Someone is still managing the building, even if she's doing it from beyond the grave. The notes continue to appear, less frequently now, but still regularly enough that tenants have learned to expect them. Rick has stopped trying to figure out who's writing them. He's also stopped trying to manage the building the way Mrs. Chen did, focusing instead on basic maintenance and rent collection. He seems to understand on some level that the real management is being handled by someone else. The elevator still makes its nightly rounds, stopping at each floor, doors opening and closing as if checking on sleeping tenants. Sometimes I hear footsteps in the hallway at night, slow and measured like someone doing security rounds. Sometimes I smell that light floral perfume in the stairwell, or catch a glimpse of gray hair and a buttoned cardigan reflected in the lobby's glass doors. The building runs smoothly. Packages don't go missing. Noise complaints resolve themselves before they become serious problems. The heat is distributed evenly, and repairs are made promptly. Not because Rick is particularly competent, but because Mrs. Chen is still here, still doing her job, still making sure her tenants are comfortable and safe. I've grown accustomed to it, the way you grow accustomed to any routine. I know that when I come home from work, the lobby will be in order. I know that if I violate building policies, I'll find a polite correction on my door the next morning. I know that someone is watching over the meridian, someone who cares about the details that make a building feel like home. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I'll stand at my window and look down at the courtyard. Occasionally I'll see her there, clipboard in hand, making notes about something that needs attention. She never looks up at my window, never acknowledges that I'm watching, but I think she knows I'm there. I think she knows all of us are there. And that's why she stays, because Mrs. Chen never really left the meridian. Death was just another tenant regulation for her to work around, another building rule to adapt to. She found a way to keep doing her job, to keep taking care of the people who lived under her roof, to keep managing a building that needs her attention. And in the morning, if there's something I need to correct, there will be a cream-colored note on my door, written in her familiar handwriting, signed, Building Management, M. Chen, Ext 101. The extension still doesn't work, but somehow she always gets the message through. The mirror that never reflected me. The bathroom mirror stopped showing my face 3 weeks ago, and I haven't told anyone because I'm not sure they'd believe me. It still reflects everything else perfectly. The white tiles behind me, the shower curtain with its faded blue pattern, even the small scar on my left shoulder from when I fell off my bike as a kid. But where my face should be, there's just empty space, like I'm wearing an invisible mask that extends from my hairline to my chin. I discovered it on a Tuesday morning while getting ready for work. I'd been going through the motions of my usual routine, shower, shave, brush teeth, when I glanced up and saw nothing where my reflection should have been. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe condensation from the hot shower, creating some kind of optical illusion. I wiped the mirror clean with my towel, but the emptiness remained. My hand appeared in the reflection as I wiped, my wedding ring catching the overhead light, but my face was simply absent. The strange thing is, I can still see myself in other mirrors. The hallway mirror shows me fine, as does the one in my bedroom. Even store windows and car mirrors work normally. It's only this bathroom mirror, the one I use every morning and every night, that refuses to acknowledge my existence. My wife Sarah hasn't noticed yet, probably because she uses the master bathroom upstairs while I stick to this smaller one on the main floor. We've been living somewhat separate lives since the miscarriage 6 months ago, occupying the same house but moving through it like ghosts who've forgotten how to haunt properly. She goes to bed early now, reads until she falls, asleep with the light on. I stay up late, walking through rooms that feel too big and too quiet. I work as an insurance adjuster, spending my days documenting other people's losses, flood damage, fire damage, theft. I catalog disasters and assign dollar values to grief. It's fitting work for someone whose own life feels like it's been appraised and found wanting. The pay is decent, the benefits adequate, and nobody expects me to be cheerful about it. The office building where I work has those harsh fluorescent lights that make everyone look slightly ill. My coworker Janet always complains about how they wash out her complexion, but I've started to prefer them. Under that cold light, the absence in my bathroom mirror doesn't seem quite so impossible. Everything looks a little unreal under fluorescent bulbs. I've been avoiding the bathroom mirror as much as possible, which means I've been avoiding looking at myself at all. I brush my teeth with my eyes closed, shave by feel, comb my hair while staring at the wall. It's surprisingly easy to navigate a morning routine without seeing yourself, though I did nick my jaw twice last week because I couldn't judge the angle of the razor properly. The first week, I convinced myself it was stress. Grief does strange things to perception, I reasoned. I'd read about people experiencing visual disturbances after trauma, seeing movement in their peripheral vision, feeling watched when alone. Maybe my brain was just processing loss in an unusual way. The mind protects itself through all kinds of elaborate mechanisms, but by the second week I had to admit this wasn't a stress response or a hallucination. I'd tested it thoroughly. I brought a hand mirror into the bathroom and could see my face in it perfectly, while the wall mirror showed only empty space where I stood. I took photos of myself standing in front of the mirror, and in the pictures, my reflection appeared normal in the glass. Whatever was happening only affected my direct perception, not cameras or other mirrors. I started researching mirrors online, reading about their history and folklore. Mirrors have always been considered portals in various cultures, windows to other worlds, tools for divination, traps for souls. Some traditions hold that breaking a mirror doesn't bring bad luck, but rather releases something that was trapped inside. Others claim that mirrors can steal reflections, leaving the original person diminished or cursed. But this wasn't folklore. This was my bathroom, in my house, in a perfectly ordinary suburb where the most supernatural thing should have been the occasional raccoon getting into the garbage cans. I tried to think of any changes I might have made recently. Had I moved the mirror, changed the lighting, hung something new on the wall that might interfere with the reflection? The mirror itself is nothing special. A standard rectangular piece that came with the house when we bought it 5 years ago. The previous owners had done a bathroom renovation in the early 2000s, installing white subway tiles and brushed nickel fixtures. Everything was builder grade but clean and functional. We'd never had any problems with the plumbing or electrical, no mysterious cold spots or strange sounds in the walls. I began timing how long I could stand in front of the mirror before the absence of my reflection became unbearable. At first, it was only seconds before I felt a creeping anxiety, as if something was fundamentally wrong with reality itself. But gradually I found I could stand there longer, studying the space where my face should be. It wasn't just empty. There was a quality to the emptiness that suggested depth, as if I was looking into a void that extended far beyond the surface of the glass. My reflection blinks after me. The delay started small, maybe a fraction of a second, that I almost didn't notice. I'd blink and my reflection in the bathroom mirror would blink just a moment later, like an actor slightly behind their cue. At first I thought I was imagining it. Sleep deprivation playing tricks on my perception after weeks of insomnia following my mother's death. I'd been staying in her house for 2 months now, sorting through 50 years of accumulated possessions and trying to decide what to keep, what to sell, what to throw away. The house felt too big for one person, all high ceilings and long hallways that seemed to echo even when I was trying to move quietly. My mother had lived alone here for the last decade after my father died, and now I understood why she'd started talking to herself near the end. The silence was oppressive. The bathroom where I noticed the delay was her master bathroom, connected to the bedroom where she'd spent her final weeks. It was a large space with double sinks, though she'd only used one in recent years. The mirror above the sinks ran the full length of the vanity, reflecting both sides of the room and creating an infinity effect when the light hit it right. She'd kept it spotlessly clean, as she had everything else in the house. I'd been using this bathroom because my childhood bedroom upstairs had a much smaller mirror, and I needed the space to spread out my toiletries and morning routine. Working. Through grief, I'd found comfort in maintaining normal patterns. Shower, shave, coffee, then tackle another room of possessions to sort. The routine kept me anchored when everything else felt unmoored. The first time I noticed the delay, I was brushing my teeth before bed. I blinked to clear some water from my eyes, and in my peripheral vision, I caught my reflection blinking a beat later. I stopped mid-brush and stared at myself in the mirror, toothpaste foam still in my mouth. When I blinked again deliberately, my reflection seemed to follow normally. I convinced myself I'd imagined it, but over the next few days, the delay became more pronounced. A quarter second, then half a second, then almost a full second between my blink and my reflection's response. It was subtle enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been spending so much time in front of that mirror, but unmistakable once I knew to look for it. I started testing it obsessively. I'd stand in front of the mirror and blink rapidly, watching my reflection struggle to keep up like a video with audio sync issues. Sometimes the delay was consistent, sometimes it varied. Occasionally, my reflection would blink when I hadn't blinked at all, as if it was trying to catch up on missed cues. The house had been in our family since 1962, built when the neighborhood was all new construction and young families. My parents had raised me and my sister here, had hosted countless birthday parties and holiday dinners in these rooms. I had memories tied to every corner. Learning to ride a bike in the driveway, building blanket forts in the living room, sneaking downstairs on Christmas mornings. But now the house felt different, as if my mother's absence had changed its fundamental nature. Rooms seemed larger and darker. The familiar creaks and settles of an old house sounded more ominous. I found myself leaving lights on in rooms I wasn't using, something my frugal mother never would have tolerated. I tried using other mirrors in the house to see if the delay occurred elsewhere. The hallway mirror reflected normally, as did the one in the guest bathroom. Even the mirrored closet doors in my mother's bedroom showed my movements in perfect synchronization. It was only the master bathroom mirror that lagged behind, as if something was interfering with the connection between me and my reflection. My sister lived 3 states away and couldn't come help with the house sorting, so I'd been handling everything alone. We talked on the phone most evenings, and I considered telling her about the mirror, but I couldn't figure out how to explain it without sounding like the grief was affecting my mental stability. She already worried that I was isolating myself in the empty house instead of going back to my apartment in the city. The delay grew longer. 2 seconds, then 3, then 5. My reflection began to feel like a separate entity, mimicking my movements but always a beat behind, like a shy child following an older sibling. I started making sudden movements to see if I could catch it off guard. Quick head turns, unexpected gestures, rapid facial expressions. My reflection would scramble to keep up, sometimes overcompensating with movements that seemed slightly too pronounced. I researched the house's history, wondering if there might be some explanation rooted in the building's past. The previous owner had been an elderly widow who'd lived there for 15 years before selling to my parents. Before that, it had been owned by the original family who'd built it, who'd raised 4 children there before moving to Florida in the 1970s. Nothing unusual in the records. No deaths in the house. No reported problems. No reason why a mirror might start behaving strangely after decades of normal function. The bathroom itself had been remodeled twice since my parents bought the house. They'd updated it in the 1980s with mauve tiles and gold fixtures, then again in the early 2000s with the current neutral palette. The mirror had been replaced during the second renovation, so it was relatively new, maybe 15 years old at most. There was nothing antique or mysterious about it, just a standard piece installed by local contractors. I began to dread using the bathroom but couldn't avoid it entirely. The delay was now noticeable enough that I could blink, count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, and then watch my reflection blink back. It felt like having a conversation with someone who was always interrupting themselves, constantly a few words behind in the dialogue. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in my mother's bed, the one I'd been using because it was more comfortable than the twin bed in my childhood room, and think about the delayed reflection. Was it getting worse? Would it continue to slow until my reflection became completely disconnected from my actions? What would happen if I stood in front of the mirror and my reflection simply stopped responding altogether? I traded places with a shadow in the shower. The shower curtain was opaque white plastic. Nothing special from the hardware store, but lately I'd been seeing a shadow behind it when no one else was home. Not my own shadow. This one was taller, broader at the shoulders, and moved independently of my movements. I'd first noticed it 3 weeks ago while washing dishes at the kitchen sink, which had a direct line of sight to the bathroom doorway. I live alone in a converted garage apartment behind my landlord's main house. It's a small space. Basically, one room with a kitchenette, plus a tiny bathroom with a shower stall. The rent is cheap because the neighborhood isn't great, and the conversion was done on a budget with thin walls and minimal insulation. I can hear everything that happens in the main house, and presumably they can hear everything I do, though we all pretend otherwise. The bathroom has no window, just an exhaust fan that sounds like a helicopter when it runs. The shower stall is cramped, barely big enough for one person, with a plastic curtain that hangs from a curved rod. The whole setup is meant for efficiency rather than comfort, but it serves its purpose for someone who showers quickly and doesn't require luxury. Work night shifts at a medical supply warehouse, loading trucks and filling orders from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. It's solitary work that suits me fine. I've never been particularly social, and the night schedule means I rarely have to interact with neighbors or deal with daytime noise. I sleep during the day with blackout curtains drawn, wake up around 4 p.m., eat something, shower, and head to work. The shadow first appeared on a Tuesday afternoon when I was making coffee before my shower. The bathroom door was open, and I caught movement behind the shower curtain in my peripheral vision. Just a quick shift, like someone adjusting their position under the water. But the shower wasn't running, and I was alone in the apartment. Walked over to investigate, pulling the curtain aside to reveal an empty stall. No water dripping, no condensation on the walls, No sign that anyone had been there. The drain was dry, the soap dispenser untouched. I checked the apartment door, still locked, security chain still in place. No one could have entered without me knowing. I convinced myself I'd imagined it, probably a trick of light and shadow created by the angle of the afternoon sun filtering through the main room. The mind sees patterns where none exist, especially when you're tired from working nights and sleeping irregularly. I'd been having trouble adjusting to the schedule change. I'd only been on night shift for a few months after getting laid off from my previous day job, but the shadow appeared again the next day, and the day after that. Always when I wasn't. Looking directly at the shower, always gone when I investigated. It seemed to have a routine, appearing sometime between 4 and 5 p.m., roughly when I was getting ready for work. The timing was so consistent that I started expecting it, glancing toward the bathroom to see if today would be another shadow day. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, lived in the main house with her adult son and his girlfriend. They were quiet tenants of my space, respectful of boundaries, never bothering me about anything unless the rent was late. The son worked construction and left early each morning. The girlfriend worked retail and came home tired each evening. None of them would have any reason to be in my apartment, and besides, I would have heard them enter. I started paying closer attention to the shadow's movements. It wasn't random. There was a pattern to how it shifted behind the curtain. First, it would appear near the shower head, then move toward the far end of the stall, then back toward the center. The movements were deliberate, purposeful, like someone going through the motions of actually showering. Reaching for soap, turning to rinse, adjusting the water temperature. The shadow's proportions were wrong for any of the people who lived in the main house. Mrs. Chen was elderly and petite, maybe 5 feet tall. Her son was average height but thin from physical work. The girlfriend was taller but had a slight build. This shadow suggested someone broad-shouldered and substantial, at least 6 feet tall. I tried to catch it by approaching the bathroom quietly, but the old floorboards creaked no matter how carefully I walked. By the time I reached the doorway, the shadow would be gone, leaving me staring at an empty shower stall and feeling foolish. I considered setting up my phone to record the bathroom, but the idea of surveilling my own living space felt paranoid and intrusive. After 2 weeks of daily shadow appearances, I decided to experiment. If something was using my shower, maybe I could interact with it somehow. I started leaving the bathroom door open and making noise in the kitchen during the shadow's usual appearance time, dropping spoons, running water, opening and closing cabinet doors, anything to see if the shadow would react. It did react. When I made noise, the shadow would pause in its movements, as if listening. Sometimes it would move toward the front of the shower stall, closer to the curtain as if trying to determine what was happening outside. The interaction felt almost conversational, like we were acknowledging each other's presence without direct contact. This should have been terrifying, but instead I found it oddly comforting. Living alone had been lonelier than I'd expected, especially with the night work schedule that put me out of sync with normal social rhythms. Having some kind of presence in the apartment, even a mysterious one, made the space feel less empty. Started talking to the shadow quietly while making my afternoon coffee. "Good afternoon," I'd say toward the bathroom. "Hope you had a good shower." I felt ridiculous, but the shadow seemed to respond, shifting slightly as if acknowledging the greeting. It was probably coincidence, but I chose to interpret it as communication. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after the first sighting. I was running late for work and needed to shower quickly. I rushed into the bathroom without checking for the shadow first, turned on the water, and stepped into the stall. The water was already warm, as if someone had been using it recently, though I hadn't heard the shower running. As I reached for the shampoo, I saw my own shadow on the curtain. But it was wrong. The shadow was too tall, too broad, moving differently than my actual movements. I was raising my left hand to my hair, but the shadow raised its right hand to shoulder height. I was facing the shower head, but the shadow was turned sideways. I froze, watching this impossible shadow perform actions. I wasn't performing. It reached for something I couldn't see, turned its head in directions I wasn't turning mine, moved with a confidence and familiarity that suggested it had been using this shower much longer than I had been living here. Then I understood. The shadow I'd been seeing behind the curtain wasn't someone else using my shower. It was me, or some version of me, displaced in time or space, going through shower routines that I hadn't performed yet or had performed in some other reality. And now, somehow, I was seeing both versions simultaneously. The displacement became more pronounced. My actual movements felt sluggish and disconnected, while the shadow moved with fluid precision. I tried to make my movements match the shadows, but I was always a beat behind, like trying to dance to music with a slight delay. The harder I tried to synchronize, the more disconnected I felt from my own body. He lived alone, but something else was using. The shower Marcus had been living alone in the duplex for 8 months, ever since his roommate Dave moved out to live with his girlfriend. The place was more than Marcus could afford on his substitute teacher salary, but he'd hoped to find another roommate before the lease renewal. That was 3 months ago, and he still hadn't found anyone suitable. Most of the people who responded to his ads were either obviously unreliable or gave him an uncomfortable feeling during the initial meeting. The duplex was built in the 1940s and showed its age in charming ways. Hardwood floors with decades of character marks, built-in bookshelves with glass doors, and original tile work in the bathroom that would cost a fortune to replicate today. The landlord, Mr. Petrov, lived in the other half of the building and maintained both units with meticulous care. He was retired from some kind of engineering job and treated property maintenance like a science project. Marcus taught at 3 different schools in the district, filling in for teachers who were sick or on maternity leave. It meant irregular schedules and inconsistent income, but he enjoyed the variety and the challenge of adapting to different classroom environments. Some days he taught kindergarten art, other days he supervised high school study halls. The unpredictability kept him engaged in ways that a permanent position might not have. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Thursday evening in late October. Marcus had just finished grading a stack of 3rd-grade math worksheets and was settling in to watch a movie when he heard the shower turn on in the bathroom. He muted the television and listened, wondering if he'd somehow forgotten that he'd started the water running for some reason. But he distinctly remembered using the bathroom an hour earlier and hadn't touched the shower controls. He walked to the bathroom door, which was closed, and listened to the steady sound of water hitting the tile walls. Steam was beginning to seep under the door, suggesting that someone had been in there long enough for the small room to heat up. Marcus knocked gently. "Hello?" No response. He tried the handle and found the door unlocked. Opening it slowly, he peered into the steamy bathroom and saw the shower curtain drawn closed, water definitely running behind it. But he was alone in the apartment, and all the exterior doors were locked with deadbolts that required keys from both sides. He called out again, louder this time. "Is someone in there?" Still no answer. The shower continued running at what sounded like full pressure, both hot and cold taps open. Marcus approached the tub cautiously and reached for the curtain, then hesitated. What if someone was behind it? But if someone had broken in, wouldn't they have responded to his calls? He pulled the curtain aside quickly, like removing a Band-Aid. The room 17 was never meant to be opened. Some doors are meant to stay closed. This is something I learned too late, after curiosity and circumstance conspired to show me what lay behind a door that had been sealed for good reason. I worked nights at the Grandview Hotel, have for the past 2 years, and I thought I knew every corner of the building. Every creaking floorboard, every burnt-out bulb, every room that needed extra attention. I was wrong about that last part. The Grandview sits on the edge of downtown, close enough to the business district to attract corporate travelers, but far enough from the trendy areas to keep the rates reasonable. It's a solid, unremarkable hotel built in the 1960s, the kind of place where traveling salesmen stay and insurance adjusters conduct meetings in the lobby's worn leather chairs. 18 floors, 212 rooms, and a staff small, enough that everyone knows everyone else's business. I took the night shift because it paid better and because I needed the quiet. My days were spent in community college classes, working toward a degree in hospitality management that I hoped would eventually get me out of the night audit position and into something with regular hours and better prospects. The Grandview wasn't my dream job, but it was a stepping stone, and the overnight shift gave me time to study between the occasional check-in and the routine security rounds. The hotel was rarely full, especially during the week. Business travelers would filter, and throughout the evening, check in with minimal conversation and disappear into their rooms to prepare for morning meetings. By midnight, the lobby would be empty except for me behind the front desk, the soft jazz playing through the sound system, and the occasional late arrival who'd gotten lost or delayed. I liked the solitude. After years of chaos following my father's death and my mother's subsequent breakdown, the predictable rhythm of night work was therapeutic. Clock in at 11, process the day's paperwork, make security rounds at 1 and 4 a.m., handle any guest issues that arose, and clock out at 7 when the morning shift arrived. Simple, quiet, and mine to control. The Grandview's layout was straightforward. 18 floors, 12 rooms per floor, numbered sequentially from 101 to 1812. The first floor housed the lobby, restaurant, and meeting rooms. Floors 2 through 18 were guest rooms, accessed by 2 elevators and a stairwell at each end of the building. I'd walked every hallway dozens of times during my security rounds, noting which rooms had do not disturb signs, which had lights still on past midnight, which had guests who liked to talk loudly on their phones at inappropriate hours. It was during one of these rounds, about 6 months into my employment, that I first noticed the inconsistency. I was walking down the second floor hallway, checking that fire exit doors were properly closed and noting a burnt-out bulb near the ice machine, when I realized the room numbers didn't add up correctly. The hallway ran from 201 to 212, but the spacing seemed wrong. There was too much distance between rooms 216 and 218. As if another door should have been there. I stopped and counted the doors. 201, 203, 205, 207, 209, 211. Then a longer stretch of wall, blank except for a faded rectangular outline where something had once been mounted. Then 219, 221, 223, and so on to the end of the hallway. The even-numbered rooms were on the opposite side. 202, 204, 206, 208, 210, 212. Then another long stretch of blank wall. Then 220, 222, 224. I stood in the hallway, counting and recounting, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Every other floor in the building had 12 rooms, numbered sequentially, but the second floor was missing rooms 213 through 218 on one side and 214 through 218 on the other. 6 rooms that should have existed but didn't. I pulled out my phone and opened the hotel's floor plan app that we used for maintenance requests. The second floor showed 12 rooms, numbered 201 through 212. No mention of the missing numbers, no indication that there had ever been additional rooms in the spaces I'd noticed. But the space was there. Too much space to be accounted for by structural walls or mechanical systems. Space where rooms should have been but weren't. I asked Jerry about it the next morning when he came in for the day shift. Jerry had been working at the Grandview for 8 years, longer than anyone else, on staff, and he knew the building's quirks better than most people know their own homes. Second floor's always been weird, he said, not looking up from the computer as he logged in. Some kind of renovation back in the day. They combined rooms or something. Why? Just noticed the room numbers don't match the spacing, I said. Looks like there should be more rooms than there are. Jerry shrugged. Old building. Things get changed around over the years. Wouldn't worry about it. But I did worry about it, in the way that small mysteries tend to occupy your mind when you have long, quiet hours to think. During my security rounds, I'd pause in that second-floor hallway and study the blank walls, trying to discern any signs of doorways that had been sealed over. The walls looked solid, painted the same institutional beige as the rest of the building, but there were subtle variations in texture that suggested something underneath. I started paying attention to the other floors, checking whether similar discrepancies existed elsewhere in the building. They didn't. Every other floor had exactly 12 rooms, numbered sequentially with consistent spacing and no unexplained gaps. Only the second floor had that strange dead space where rooms should have been. The mystery might have remained just that, a minor curiosity to occupy my thoughts during slow nights, if not for Mrs. Kowalski. Mrs. Kowalski was 92 years old and had been living at the Grandview for 6 months. Not as a guest exactly, but as a long-term resident. Her family had arranged for her to stay in room 238 while they sorted out her living situation after she'd fallen and broken her hip. The hotel offered extended stay rates that were cheaper than assisted living and more comfortable than a nursing home, so she'd settled in with her medications, her photo albums, and her endless supply of hard candies that she offered to anyone who would sit and talk with her. She was lonely, which was why she often came down to the lobby during my shift. Sleep came irregularly at her age, she explained, and she liked having someone to talk to during the long hours between midnight and dawn. I didn't mind the company. She had stories about the neighborhood from decades past, and she was sharp, enough to carry on conversations about current events and the classes I was taking. It was during one of these late-night conversations, sometime in March, that she mentioned room 217. I used to stay in 217 when I'd visit my sister downtown, she said, unwrapping one of her peppermint candies. This was back in the 70s, before the place got so run down. Lovely room, corner unit with windows facing both directions, best light in the building. I looked up from the textbook I'd been reading. Room 217? Oh yes. I must have stayed there a dozen times over the years. My sister lived just a few blocks away, and it was convenient to have a place to stay when I'd come down for the weekend. Much nicer than driving back upstate in the dark. Mrs. Kowalski, I said carefully, there is no room 217. The second floor only goes up to 212. She gave me the patient look that elderly people reserve for young people who've said something obviously incorrect. Of course there's a room 217. I have pictures of myself standing in front of the door. Would you like to see them? She did have pictures. The next night, she brought down a photo album filled with black and white snapshots from her visits to the city. There, on page 12, was a photograph of a younger Mrs. Kowalski standing in front of a hotel room door. The number on the door was clearly visible, 217. That was Christmas of 1974, she said, pointing to the photo. My sister had just gotten divorced, and I came down to spend the holidays with her. Stayed in 217 for a week. I studied the photograph. The hallway looked like the Grandview's hallways, with the same carpet pattern and the same style of wall sconces that still existed throughout the building. But the door Mrs. Kowalski was standing in front of was in a part of the second floor that was now blank wall. Are you sure this was taken at the Grandview? I asked. Positive. I have the receipts somewhere if you'd like to see those too. She did have receipts. Carbon copies of hotel bills from the Grandview dating from 1972 to 1978, all for room 217. The letterhead was the same, the address was the same, even the phone number matched the current hotel information. What happened to the room? I asked. Mrs. Kowalski's expression grew thoughtful, then troubled. There was an incident, she said slowly. Something unpleasant. I never got the full story, but after 1978, they stopped renting that room. And then, the next time I visited, it was just gone. Gone how? The door wasn't there anymore. The whole hallway had been changed around. Rooms renumbered, walls moved, like they'd erased that part of the building. She closed the photo album and held it against her chest. I asked at the front desk, but they said they'd never had a room, 217. Said I must be thinking of a different hotel. But you have the receipts. I have the receipts, she agreed. But nobody wanted to see them. That night, after Mrs. Kowalski had gone back to her room, I stood in the second-floor hallway with her photographs and receipts, trying to match her memories to the current reality. The space was right. Where she said room 217 had been, there, was now blank wall, but the proportions matched what should have been a corner room with windows facing two directions. I pressed my hand against the wall where the door should have been. The paint was slightly different there, a shade or two lighter than the surrounding areas, as if it had been applied more recently. When I knocked on the wall, it sounded hollow underneath, not solid like a structural wall should sound. I was getting obsessed, and I knew it. The mystery of the missing rooms was interfering with my work and my studies. I'd find myself standing in that hallway for 20 minutes at a time during security rounds, examining the walls for signs of sealed doorways, measuring distances, with my feet, trying to construct a mental blueprint of what the second floor had looked like before the renovation that had erased 6. The ghost still rides the elevator at 2:48. AMI never believed in ghosts until I started working the night shift at Meridian Tower. Even now, 3 months after I quit that job, I still check the time whenever I wake up in the middle of the night. If the clock reads 2:48, I stay in bed with the covers pulled up to my chin until I see 2:49. Because at 2:48 a.m. in a 40-story office building downtown, something rides the elevator that shouldn't be there. My name is Marcus, and I used to be a security guard. Not the kind you see in movies, chasing down criminals or uncovering conspiracies. I was the kind who sat behind a desk in a marble lobby, watching monitors and signing in late-working executives. It was supposed to be easy money. Show up at midnight, make rounds every 2 hours, keep an eye on things until the day shift arrived at 8. The building management company said it was mostly just insurance liability. Modern buildings have electronic systems that handle most security concerns. They just needed a warm body in case something went wrong. Meridian Tower was one of those glass and steel monuments to corporate success that sprouted up downtown in the 90s. 40 floors of law firms, accounting practices, consulting groups, and investment companies. The kind of place where people wore expensive suits and worked late into the night chasing deals and deadlines. During the day, it bustled with the energy of ambition and money. At night, it was supposed to be empty except for the cleaning crews and me. The job interview was simple. The building manager, a tired-looking woman named Patricia Wells, showed me around the lobby and explained the basic requirements. Make sure the doors stayed locked after business hours. Monitor the security cameras. Walk through each floor twice per shift to check for anything unusual. Sign in anyone who had legitimate after-hours business and escort them to their destination. It's mostly quiet, she told me as we stood in front of the elevator bank. The building empties out by 9 most nights. You'll get the occasional workaholic, staying late, but they usually call down to let you know they're here. The cleaning crews come through between 1 and 4 a.m., but they have their own key cards and know not to bother you unless there's a problem. She handed me a security badge and a set of keys. One thing, she said, pausing by the elevator. Elevator number 3 has been having some mechanical issues. Don't use it for your rounds. Stick to elevators 1, 2, and 4. Maintenance is working on fixing it, but until then it's off limits. I looked at the 4 elevator doors. They were identical except for the brass numbers above them. Elevator 3 looked no different from the others, but there was yellow caution tape stretched across the call buttons. What kind of mechanical issues? I asked. It stops on floors randomly, Patricia said. Sometimes it won't respond to button commands. Sometimes it moves between floors on its own. The repair company thinks it's an electrical problem with the control system, but they haven't been able to figure it out yet. Rather than risk someone getting stuck, we just took it out of service. She showed me the security office, a small room behind the lobby with banks of monitors showing camera feeds from throughout the building. There was a desk with a logbook, a coffee maker, and a small refrigerator. Everything I'd need to get through. 8 hours of mostly sitting and watching. Any questions? She asked. I shook my head. It seemed straightforward enough. Good. You start Monday night. Welcome to Meridian Tower. My first week went exactly as Patricia had described. The building was quiet after 9 p.m. A few dedicated workers stayed late, but they were absorbed in their own tasks and barely acknowledged me when I made my rounds. The cleaning crews were efficient and professional, working their way through the floors with industrial vacuum cleaners and supply carts. I spent most of my time in the security office reading paperback novels and watching the camera feeds cycle through empty hallways and dark offices. The only unusual thing was elevator 3. Even though it was supposed to be out of service, I could hear it moving sometimes. The mechanical sounds of cables and counterweights shifting, the distinctive ding when it reached a floor. At first, I assumed the repair company was working on it during off hours, but when I checked the logbook, there were no entries for maintenance visits. I mentioned it to Patricia during my first week. You're hearing it move? She asked, frowning. Yeah, mostly late at night, around 2 or 3 a.m. It sounds like it's stopping on different floors. That's impossible. We had the power disconnected to that elevator last month. It shouldn't be moving at all. She made a note in her planner and said she'd have the repair company check it again. But nothing changed. Every night, usually sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, I'd hear elevator 3 running its mysterious routes through the building. Started paying closer attention to the camera feeds during those times. The monitors showed views of each elevator bank on every floor, and I could see the indicator lights above the doors showing which floors the elevators were visiting. Elevators 1, 2, and 4 stayed put unless someone called them, but elevator 3's indicator lights would illuminate in sequence as it traveled through the building, even though no one was calling it and it was supposed to be disconnected from power. The pattern was always the same. It would start at the ground floor lobby, then rise to the 5th floor. From there, it would go to the 12th floor, then the 23rd, then the 31st, and finally to the 38th floor. It would pause at each floor for about 30 seconds, then continue to the next one. After reaching the 38th floor, it would descend back to the lobby and stop. I timed it one night. The entire sequence took exactly 12 minutes, and it always started at 2:48 a.m. By my 3rd week, I'd developed a routine around elevator 3's nightly journey. At 2:45, I'd turn my attention to the monitors showing the elevator banks. At 2:48, the indicator light would illuminate at the lobby level, and I'd watch the sequence play out. 5th floor, 12th floor, 23rd, 31st, 38th, then back down. Every night, exactly the same. I started checking the tenant directory to see what businesses were located on those specific floors. 5th floor, Morrison, Klein & Associates, a mid-sized law firm. 12th floor, Hartwell Consulting Group. 23rd floor, Prestige Investment Management. 31st floor, Davidson and Partners Accounting, 38th floor, Blackwood Financial Services. There was no obvious connection between these companies. Different industries, different client bases, different sized operations. The only thing they had in common was that they were all located on floors where Elevator 3 made its mysterious stops. I decided to investigate more directly. On a Thursday night during my 4th week, I left the security office at 2:47 and positioned myself in the lobby where I could see Elevator 3. The building was quiet except for the ambient sounds of heating systems and distant traffic. The cleaning crews had finished their work and left an hour earlier. At exactly 2:48, I heard the elevator machinery engage. The cables began moving, and the counterweights shifted in their shafts. But the elevator doors never opened. The indicator light above Elevator 3 illuminated, showing that it was active, but there was no one in the lobby to call it. I watched the indicator lights as the elevator rose to the 5th floor. When it stopped, I switched my attention to the monitor showing the 5th floor elevator bank. The doors of Elevator 3 were opening and closing, just as they would if someone were getting on or off. But the hallway was empty. The camera showed nothing but carpet and office doors and the soft glow of emergency lighting. The same thing happened on every floor. The elevator would stop. The doors would open and close, but the security cameras showed no one getting on or off. It was as if the elevator was making stops for passengers who weren't there, following a route that someone had programmed into its memory. When the sequence finished and Elevator 3 returned to the lobby, I walked over to examine it more closely. The caution tape was still in place and the call buttons were still disabled. There was no sign that anyone had tampered with the elevator or removed the safety barriers. But as I stood there, I caught a scent that hadn't been there before. Something faint but distinctive. Perfume maybe, or aftershave. Something personal and human in the sterile environment of the office building lobby. I called Patricia the next morning and told her what I'd observed. "The elevator is definitely moving," I said. "Every night at the same time, making stops on the same floors. But there's no one using it. The security cameras don't show any people getting on or off." There was a long pause on her end. "Marcus, I need to ask you something and I want you to be honest with me. Are you taking anything, medication, alcohol, anything that might affect your perception?" "No, nothing like that. I'm telling you what I saw. Because what you're describing is impossible. We had the power disconnected to that elevator. It's not receiving electricity. It can't move." But I knew what I'd seen and I knew what I'd heard. Elevator 3 was running its nightly route whether it had power or not, whether it was supposed to be in service or not. "Maybe you should come in one night and see for yourself," I suggested. "Maybe I should," she said. Patricia showed up the following Monday at 2:30 a.m. She looked skeptical and slightly annoyed, like someone who'd been called away from more important tasks to deal with an employee's overactive imagination. She brought a maintenance supervisor named Carl, a heavyset man with calloused hands who clearly thought this was a waste of his time. "Show me," Patricia said. We waited in the lobby, watching the elevator bank. At 2:47, I pointed to Elevator 3. "Any minute now," I said. At 2:48, the machinery engaged. The sound of cables moving, counterweights shifting, the mechanical orchestra of an elevator system coming to life. Patricia and Carl looked at each other, then at the indicator light above. "Elevator 3 as it illuminated." "That's impossible," Carl muttered. He walked to the maintenance panel hidden behind a locked cover near the elevator bank. Using a key from his ring, he opened the panel and examined the controls inside. Powers, definitely disconnected. These circuits are dead. But Elevator 3 continued its ascent to the 5th floor. We watched the indicator lights track its progress, listened to the mechanical sounds echoing through the building's elevator shafts. "Could there be a backup power source?" Patricia asked. "No," Carl said, his voice tight with confusion. Even if there was, the control circuits are physically disconnected. This elevator shouldn't be able to move at all. We went to the security office and watched the camera feeds as elevator 3 made its rounds. 5th floor, doors opening and closing in an empty hallway. 12th floor, same thing. 23rd, 31st, 38th. Every stop exactly as I described. Every pause lasting the same amount of time. When the sequence finished, and elevator 3 returned to the lobby, Carl immediately called the repair company. Within an hour, 2 technicians arrived and began examining the elevator's mechanical and electrical systems. They found nothing wrong. More importantly, they confirmed that the elevator had no power source. The electrical connections had been properly disconnected, and there was no backup system that could account for the movement we'd witnessed. "I've been working on elevators for 20 years, one of the technicians told us. "I've never seen anything like this. By every measure we have, this elevator is completely dead. It shouldn't be able to move at all." But it had moved. We'd all seen it, heard it, tracked its progress on the security monitors. Patricia looked shaken. "What do you think is causing it?" The technician shrugged. "I have no idea. Maybe there's some kind of mechanical energy stored in the system that we don't understand. Maybe there's an electrical source we haven't located. Or maybe..." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Maybe what?" I asked. "Maybe it's not a mechanical problem at all." After the technicians left, Patricia asked me to keep detailed logs of elevator 3's activity. Times, duration, any variations in the pattern. She also asked me not to discuss what we'd witnessed with other employees. "I don't want rumors starting," she said. "Bad for building morale." But I could tell she was more disturbed than she wanted to admit. The confident, professional demeanor she'd shown during my interview was gone, replaced by the uncertainty of someone whose understanding of how things worked had been shaken. I started keeping the log she requested, but I also started my own research. During slow periods at work, I used the security office computer to look up information about Meridian Tower. Construction history, previous tenants, any incidents that might explain what we were experiencing. The building had been completed in 1994, built by Hartwell Construction Group, the same company that now occupied the 12th floor, one of elevator 3's stops. The construction had been routine except for one incident. In February 1995, 3 months after the building opened, a man named David Reese had fallen down an elevator shaft and died. Reese had been working late at his job with Blackwood Financial Services on the 38th floor. According to the police report, he'd been waiting for an elevator when the doors opened, but the elevator car wasn't there. He'd stepped forward in the dark and fallen 40 stories to his death. The investigation concluded that it was an accident caused by a malfunction in the elevator's safety systems. The doors had opened even though the car was stopped several floors below. Reese, tired from working late and not paying careful attention, had stepped into what he thought was an elevator car and instead found empty space. The elevator involved in the accident was number 3. After Reese's death, elevator 3 had been extensively repaired and upgraded with additional safety systems. It had operated normally for years without incident, but now 28 years later it was running a route that stopped at every floor where David Reese had once had business. I cross-referenced the tenant directory with archived business records. In 1995, when Reese died, he'd been working on legal documents for Morrison, Klein & Associates on the 5th floor. He'd had meetings scheduled with Hartwell Consulting Group on the 12th floor. He'd been managing investment accounts for clients at Prestige Investment Management on the 23rd floor. He'd been coordinating with Davidson and Partners Accounting on the 31st floor for tax preparation. And he'd worked at Blackwood Financial Services on the 38th floor. Elevator 3 was retracing David Reese's final work route. I didn't tell Patricia about my research immediately. I wanted to be sure before I started talking about dead men riding elevators. Instead, I began paying closer attention to what happened during Elevator 3's nightly journey. The pattern never varied, always starting at 2:48 a.m., always making the same stops in the same order, always lasting exactly 12 minutes. But I started noticing details I'd missed before. On the 5th floor, the elevator would pause for 30 seconds, doors opening and closing once. On the 12th floor, it would do the same thing, but sometimes the pause lasted a few seconds longer. On the 23rd floor, the doors would open and close twice, as if someone were hesitating about getting off. The 31st floor was always a brief stop, doors opening and closing quickly. But on the 38th floor, the elevator would pause for nearly a full minute, doors opening and closing multiple times. It was as if someone were getting off at each floor, conducting business, then getting back on to continue to the next stop. Someone following a familiar routine, visiting familiar places, taking care of familiar tasks. Someone who didn't know he was dead. I started timing my rounds to coincide with Elevator 3's journey. When it stopped at the 5th floor, I'd take Elevator 1 to the same floor and walk through the offices of Morrison, Klein & Associates. The space was dark and empty, but sometimes I'd catch that same scent I'd noticed in the lobby. Personal and human in the sterile office environment. On the 12th floor, home to Hartwell Consulting Group, I sometimes heard sounds that shouldn't have been there. Footsteps on carpet, the creak of an office chair, the soft rustle of papers being moved. But when I investigated, I found nothing but empty cubicles and dark conference rooms. The 23rd floor was where things got strange. Prestige investment. Management had a reception area with a large fish tank built into one wall. During the day, it was full of tropical fish swimming among artificial coral and plants. But when I checked it during Elevator 3's stop, the fish would be agitated, swimming in erratic patterns, pressing against the glass as if trying to escape from something they sensed but couldn't see. The 31st floor, Davidson and Partners, accounting, was always cold during Elevator 3's stop. Not just cool, but genuinely cold, as if someone had left a door open to the outside in the middle of winter. The temperature would return to normal within minutes of the elevator leaving, but during those 30 seconds, the office space felt like a refrigerator. But it was the 38th floor that affected me most. Blackwood Financial Services occupied the entire floor, and it was where David Reese had worked before his death. When Elevator 3 stopped there, the entire space felt occupied. Not crowded exactly, but inhabited, as if someone were moving through the offices, checking on things, making sure everything was as it should be. I'd walk through the cubicles and offices and I could feel a presence. Not threatening, but definite. Someone else was there, someone who belonged in that space, someone who was comfortable among the desks and filing cabinets and computer terminals. Sometimes I'd hear a keyboard typing, the soft click, click, click of fingers on keys. But when I followed the sound, I'd find empty workstations with computers that were powered down for the night. Sometimes I'd hear a phone ringing, but when I tried to locate it, the sound would stop and I'd realize that all the phones were silent. Once, I saw a light on in one of the corner offices. Warm yellow light spilling out into the hallway, as if someone were working late. I walked toward it, but as I got closer, the light faded until I reached the doorway and found the office dark and empty. It was during my 7th week that I finally saw him. I was on the 38th floor, making my routine check during Elevator 3's stop, when I noticed that one of the workstation computers was on. Not just the monitor, but the entire system, with programs running and documents open on the screen. I walked over to investigate, and that's when I saw the reflection, in the dark window behind the desk. A man in his 30s wearing a suit and tie sitting at the workstation with his back to me. His fingers were moving over the keyboard and I could hear the soft clicking of keys being pressed. He was working intently, focused on whatever was displayed on his screen. I turned around, but there was no one there. The chair was empty. The keyboard was still. But when I looked back at the window, the reflection was still there. David Reese, working late as he had 28 years ago, unaware that he'd died when Elevator 3's doors opened onto empty space. He looked tired, the way someone looks when they've been working too many hours and drinking too much coffee. His tie was loosened and his sleeves were rolled up. He was completely absorbed in his work, the way people get when they're trying to finish something important before they can go home. I watched his reflection for several minutes. He never looked up, never acknowledged my presence, just continued, typing and occasionally reaching for papers that weren't there. Finally, he stopped typing and stood up. He straightened his tie, rolled down his sleeves, and gathered papers from his desk. Then he walked toward the elevator, and his reflection disappeared from the window. A few moments later, I heard Elevator 3 begin its descent back to the lobby. I didn't sleep well that night, or for several nights after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David Reese's reflection in the window, working late on projects that would never be finished, preparing for meetings that would never happen, following a routine that death had not been able to break. I told Patricia about what I'd seen, though I was careful about how I presented it. I focused on the mechanical impossibility of Elevator 3's operation, the temperature changes, the unexplained sounds. I mentioned the connection to David Reese's death, but presented it as historical context rather than supernatural explanation. She listened without interruption, taking notes in the same careful way she documented my earlier reports. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Marcus," she finally said, "I've been managing this building for 8 years. In that time, I've dealt with mechanical failures, electrical problems, plumbing disasters, and tenant complaints about everything from noise to temperature to cleaning schedules. I've never dealt with anything like this." She looked at her notes, then at me. "The repair company says Elevator 3 is mechanically impossible. You're telling me it's being operated by a dead man. Either way, we have a problem that I don't know how to solve." She paused, considering. "I'm going to make some calls," she said. "See if I can find someone who specializes in unusual building problems." But before she could make those calls, Elevator 3 stopped making its nightly journey. It happened during my 8th week. I was in the security office at 2:45 watching the monitors as I had every night for nearly 2 months. At 2:48, I waited for the familiar sound of machinery engaging, for the indicator light to illuminate above Elevator 3. Nothing happened. 49 came and went, then 2:50. The building was quiet except for the normal sounds of heating systems and settling structural elements. Elevator 3 remained still and dark. I waited until 3:00, then made my regular rounds through the building. The 5th floor was quiet and normal. No unusual sense, no sense of presence. The 12th floor was the same, just empty offices and dark cubicles. The fish tank on the 23rd floor showed no signs of agitation. The 31st floor wasn't cold, and the 38th floor felt truly empty for the first time since I'd started working at Meridian Tower. David Reese was gone. I don't know why he stopped writing Elevator 3 that night. Maybe he'd finally finished whatever work he'd been trying to complete. Maybe he'd realized that 28 years had passed and it was time to let go. Maybe something about being seen, being acknowledged, had given him the closure he needed to move on. Or maybe he'd simply reached his destination. Patricia had the repair company examine Elevator 3 one more time. They found the same thing they'd found before, an elevator with no power source that shouldn't have been able to move. But now it wasn't moving. The mechanical impossibility had resolved itself as mysteriously as it had begun. After a week of normal operation, Patricia had the caution tape removed, and elevator 3 returned to service. It worked perfectly, responding to calls and carrying passengers just like any other elevator in the building. I finished out my 3-month probationary period, but I didn't sign on for permanent employment. Working night security had been difficult enough when the worst thing I had to worry about was staying awake during quiet hours. After seeing David Reese's reflection in that window, after watching him follow his final routine night after night, I realized I wasn't cut out for a job where the dead could punch a time clock. I still think about him sometimes. David Reese working late at Blackwood Financial Services, taking elevator 3 to visit clients and colleagues on other floors, following the same route he'd followed on the night he died. I wonder if he knew he was dead, or if death had simply become another part of his routine, another obligation to fulfill before he could finally go home. And I wonder if he's really gone, or if he's just waiting for the right time to call elevator 3 again. I have a new job now, working day shifts, at a small office building across town. It's quieter work, less responsibility, and I never have to worry about what might be riding the elevators after hours. But sometimes, when I'm in an elevator late at night, I check my watch. And if it's 2:48 a.m., I make sure to get off at the next floor and take the stairs instead, because some routines are too strong for death to break, and some passengers never reach their final destination. The final note was signed in blood, mine. The Steinway grand piano arrived on a Tuesday, black as a hearse and twice as ominous. I should have recognized the warning signs then, the way the movers handled it with unusual reverence, almost fear, and how they refused to meet my eyes when I signed for delivery. But I was too consumed with excitement to notice. After 20 years of playing on secondhand uprights and digital keyboards, I finally owned a real concert grand. The seller, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carmichael, had been eager to part with it. Too eager, perhaps. When I'd responded to her classified ad, she'd practically begged me to take it off her hands for a fraction of its worth. "It needs to go to someone who will play it," she'd insisted, her voice trembling over the phone. "It can't sit silent anymore." I understood that sentiment. Music was meant to be heard, not trapped behind closed lids and dusty covers. As a composer, struggling to make ends meet in my cramped apartment, I'd dreamed of owning an instrument worthy of my ambitions. The Steinway would change everything. The piano dominated my living room, its ebony surface reflecting the afternoon light streaming through my windows. I ran my fingers along its curves, savoring the smooth coolness of the wood. When I lifted the lid and exposed the keys, they gleamed like perfect teeth in a smile both beautiful and predatory. I played a simple scale first, testing the touch and tone. The sound that emerged was extraordinary, rich, warm, with overtones that seemed to linger in the air long after the keys were released. Each note possessed a clarity I'd never experienced, as if the piano were singing rather than merely producing sound. That first evening, I lost myself in playing. Hours passed unnoticed as I worked through pieces I'd struggled with on lesser instruments. The piano responded to my touch with an almost sentient awareness, anticipating my phrasing, enhancing my dynamics. It was as if the instrument and I were engaged in a conversation, each phrase building upon the last in perfect harmony. By midnight, my fingers ached, but I couldn't stop. The piano seemed to pull music from some deep well within me. Compositions I didn't remember writing flowing from my hands onto the keys. The melodies were hauntingly beautiful, yet tinged with an inexplicable sadness that made my chest tight, with emotion I couldn't name. When I finally forced myself to bed, my dreams were filled with music, complex harmonies that seemed to echo from some distant chamber, always just beyond my ability to fully grasp or remember upon waking. The next Morning brought my first indication that something was amiss. Sheet music lay scattered across the piano bench and floor, covered in my handwriting but containing compositions I had no memory of creating. The notes were intricate, challenging, written in a style that felt both familiar and foreign. At the top of the first page in my own hand were the words Nocturne in D minor for the Lost Souls. I stared at the title, confusion clouding my thoughts. I'd never written anything with that name, yet the handwriting was unmistakably mine. The composition itself was extraordinary, complex enough to challenge my abilities, yet structured with an emotional depth that spoke of years of refinement. Curiosity overrode my bewilderment. I sat at the piano and began to play the mysterious nocturne. The music that emerged was heartbreakingly beautiful, each phrase carrying a weight of sorrow that seemed to resonate in my bones. As I played, the room around me seemed to fade, replaced by shadows that danced at the edges of my vision. The final measures were particularly haunting, a descending passage that ended not with resolution, but with a sense of yearning, as if the music were reaching toward something forever out of grasp. When I lifted my hands from the keys, the silence that followed felt oppressive, almost hostile. Over the following days, the pattern repeated. Each morning I would find new compositions scattered around the piano, all written in my hand, but bearing no trace in my memory. The pieces grew increasingly complex and emotionally intense. Waltz for the Forgotten, Prelude to Eternal Rest, Sonata of the Damned. Each title more ominous than the last. I began to research the piano's history, driven by a growing unease that I couldn't shake. What I discovered chilled me to the From the Steinway had belonged to a concert pianist named Victoria Ashford, a prodigy who had dominated the classical music scene in the 1950s. Her career had been meteoric, sold-out concerts, recording contracts, critical acclaim. She was destined for immortality in the classical music world until she vanished. In 1958, at the height of her fame, Victoria had retreated to her estate for what was supposed to be a brief respite between tours. She was never seen alive again. When concerned friends finally convinced authorities to check on her, they found her body seated at her beloved Steinway, her hands still positioned on the keys. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though she was only 28, years old with no history of cardiac problems. More disturbing were the details that emerged during the investigation. Victoria had been found with sheet music scattered around her, compositions written in her hand but in a style completely different from her known works. The pieces were darker, more complex than anything she'd previously created. Several bore titles that referenced death and loss, themes entirely absent from her earlier compositions. The piano had passed through several owners since Victoria's death, but none had kept it long. Each reported strange occurrences, mysterious music heard in the night, compositions appearing without explanation, an overwhelming sense of sadness that seemed to emanate from the instrument itself. Mrs. Carmichael had been the most recent owner, inheriting it from an uncle who'd purchased it at an estate sale in the 1980s. Armed with this knowledge, I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt in strange kinship with Victoria Ashford. Like me, she'd been a serious composer, dedicated to her craft. Perhaps what others interpreted as supernatural phenomena were simply the lingering echoes of her creative spirit, trapped within the instrument she'd loved. From beyond death, I watch as new owners discover the piano, as fresh victims fall under Victoria's spell. I want to warn them, to somehow communicate the danger they face, but I am powerless to interfere. My own spirit remains tied to the instrument that claimed my life, a silent witness to the ongoing cycle of artistic seduction and supernatural consumption. The piano continues its dark journey, carrying within its beautiful form both Victoria's imprisoned hunger and my eternal vigilance. We are locked together in a harmony of opposition, predator and protector, bound by music that transcends the boundaries between life and death. And somewhere in the world, another composer opens a classified ad, reads about a beautiful Steinway, available for an impossibly low price, and feels the first stirring of desire that will ultimately lead them to our ebony prison. The music continues, the trap remains set, and the final note of our supernatural symphony waits to be signed in blood once more. The cycle begins anew, as it always has, as it always will, until someone with greater skill and stronger will than mine finds a way to break the harmonious chain that binds us all to those ivory keys and ebony depths. Until then, we wait in our prison of perfect music, predator and prey and protector, creating compositions that no living hand will ever play, singing songs that no living ear will ever hear, forever trapped in the space between sound and silence, between life and death, between love and hunger for the music that defines us all. She enforced the rules. Even from the grave principal, Margaret Thornfield never tolerated rule breakers. Not in 37 years of running Westbrook High School, and apparently not even in death. I learned this the hard way during my first semester teaching there, when I discovered that some authority figures refuse to retire their responsibilities, even when their bodies have been buried 6 feet underground. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I used to think the hardest part about being a new teacher would be lesson planning and classroom management. I was wrong. The hardest part was learning to follow the rules of a woman who'd been dead for 6 months, but still patrolled the hallways every night, making sure her school ran exactly the way she'd designed it to run. Westbrook High School sits on the outskirts of town like a red brick fortress built in 1952 when education meant discipline and discipline meant respect. 3 stories of classrooms, laboratories, and administrative offices connected by long hallways lined with metal lockers that slam shut with the definitive clang of institutional authority. The kind of school where rules were posted on every wall and enforced without exception. When I interviewed for the English position in late August, the acting principal, Dr. James Crawford, seemed nervous throughout our meeting. He kept glancing at the empty office across the hall, and twice he stopped mid-sentence to listen to sounds I couldn't hear. Mrs. Thornfield passed away in February, he explained when I asked about the previous administration. Heart attack. In her office. She'd been here since 1986, and she ran the school like... He paused, searching for the right words. Like it was her personal mission to maintain order. He showed me around the building, pointing out classrooms and facilities with the distracted air of someone whose mind was elsewhere. In the main hallway, we passed a portrait of Mrs. Thornfield hanging beside decades of other principals. She had steel gray hair pulled back severely, sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of expression that suggested she could spot trouble from 3 hallways away. She was very particular about rules, Dr. Crawford continued, as we walked past her portrait. Dress code, punctuality, classroom procedures, student behavior. She believed that education couldn't happen without structure. I nodded politely, though something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. When we reached the main office, he handed me a thick binder labeled Westbrook High School Policies and Procedures, M. Thornfield Principal. You'll want to read through this carefully, he said. Mrs. Thornfield was very thorough in documenting her expectations. The binder was impressive in its comprehensiveness. 47 pages of detailed policies covering everything from the proper way to take attendance to the acceptable volume level for hallway conversations. There were diagrams showing correct bulletin board layouts, charts outlining disciplinary procedures, and detailed schedules for everything from fire drills to parent conferences. Every page was marked with Mrs. Thornfield's initials and the date it was created or last revised. Some policies had been updated as recently as January, just weeks before her death. It was clear that she'd spent decades perfecting a system for running Westbrook High School, and she'd documented every detail with the precision of someone who intended her methods to outlast her tenure. I started teaching in September, and for the first few weeks everything seemed normal. The students were typical teenagers, testing boundaries and pushing limits in the ways teenagers always do. My classroom was on the second floor, room 237, where I taught freshman and sophomore English literature. The room had tall windows facing the parking lot and bulletin boards covered with Mrs. Thornfield's prescribed layouts for displaying student work. The other teachers were welcoming, but seemed oddly careful about following procedures. When I mentioned that I might rearrange my classroom seating chart, my neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Peterson, looked genuinely alarmed. "You should check with Dr. Crawford first," she said. Mrs. Thornfield had very specific ideas about classroom arrangements. When I asked why it mattered since Mrs. Thornfield was no longer there to object, Mrs. Peterson just gave me a strange look and said, "You'd be surprised." I dismissed it as the kind of institutional inertia that develops when strong leaders leave their positions. People get used to certain ways of doing things and continue following established patterns even after the person who created them is gone. It seemed harmless enough, and I was too busy adjusting to my new job to question the extra layers of protocol. The first sign that something was unusual came during my third week. I'd stayed late to grade papers and set up bulletin boards, working in my classroom until nearly 7 p.m. The building was quiet except for the custodial staff, who I could hear moving through the hallways with their cleaning equipment. I decided to embrace rather than fear the piano's apparent connection to its former owner. If Victoria's essence somehow remained tied to the Steinway, perhaps we could collaborate across the boundary between life and death. The idea was romantic, artistic, irresistible. That decision marked the beginning of my descent into something far darker than I could have imagined. The nocturnal compositions became more frequent and more elaborate. I would retire to bed exhausted from a day of normal practice, only to wake to find pages upon pages of new music surrounding the piano. The handwriting remained mine, but the style evolved, becoming more sophisticated and emotionally complex with each passing night. I began staying awake to observe the phenomenon, hiding in my bedroom doorway to watch the piano. What I witnessed defied rational explanation. In the depths of night, when darkness pressed against my windows like a living thing, my own hands would move across the keys with a precision and passion I'd never possessed while conscious. My body sat at the bench, but the consciousness guiding those movements was not my own. Victoria was using me as her vessel, channeling her compositions through my physical form. The realization should have horrified me, but instead it filled me with a perverse excitement. I was collaborating with one of the greatest pianists in history, serving as the conduit for musical ideas that transcended mortal limitations. The music we created together was extraordinary. Each piece pushed the boundaries of traditional composition, incorporating harmonies and structures that seemed to tap into some fundamental truth about human emotion. When I played Victoria's nocturnal compositions during the day, they moved me to tears with their beauty and depth. But there was a cost to our collaboration that I was slow to recognize. My reflection in mirrors began to look pale and hollow-eyed, as if something essential was being drained from me. I lost weight despite eating regularly, and friends commented on my increasingly gaunt appearance. Sleep became elusive even when Victoria wasn't using my body for her midnight compositions. Most disturbing were the gaps in my memory that began to appear during daylight hours. I would find myself seated at the piano with no recollection of how I'd gotten there, my fingers positioned over keys I didn't remember touching. Entire afternoons would vanish, leaving only the lingering echo of melodies I couldn't quite recall. Victoria was growing stronger, her presence within me more constant and controlling. What had begun as nocturnal visits now extended into my waking hours. I could feel her consciousness pressing against the boundaries of my own, seeking greater control, longer periods of dominance. The final compositions she created through me were masterpieces of technical brilliance and emotional devastation. Requiem for the Living, Dance of the Dying Light, Last Breath variations, each piece more complex and haunting than anything in the classical repertoire. But playing them left me exhausted and disoriented, as if each performance drew some vital essence from my being. I began to understand the true nature of Victoria's presence. She wasn't simply a lingering spirit seeking artistic expression. She was hungry, desperate to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Through our musical collaboration, she was slowly consuming my life force, using my body as a bridge back to the world of the living. The realization came too late. By the time I understood Victoria's true intentions, she had grown too strong to resist. Her consciousness had become intertwined with mine, her memories mixing with my own until I could no longer distinguish between her experiences and my recollections. I tried to stop playing, to break the connection between us. But Victoria's will had become the dominant force within my own body. My hands moved to the keys against my conscious desire, drawn by a compulsion I could no longer control. The piano had become both my instrument and my prison. The final composition began on a night when autumn rain drummed against my windows like skeletal fingers seeking entry. I felt Victoria's presence stronger than ever, her consciousness overwhelming, mine with an intensity that left me gasping for breath. My hands found the keys without conscious direction, and music poured forth with an urgency that bordered on desperation. This piece was different from the others, not merely beautiful or haunting, but alive with a malevolent purpose. Each note seemed to bind Victoria's spirit more firmly to the physical world, while simultaneously loosening my own connection to life. The music was literally pulling me across the threshold between existence and oblivion. As I played, I could see Victoria's reflection beginning to appear in the piano's polished surface, not as a ghostly apparition, but as a solid, living woman, reclaiming her place in the world. Her features were sharp and aristocratic, her eyes burning with an intelligence and ambition that had survived death itself. She was beautiful and terrible, a vampire of music and memory feeding on my life to fuel her resurrection. The composition built to its climax, each passage more complex and demanding than the last. My fingers flew across the keys with supernatural speed and precision, executing runs and arpeggios that should have been impossible for human hands to perform. Victoria was pushing my body beyond its natural limitations, burning through my life, force like fuel in a furnace. I could feel myself fading, my consciousness becoming dim and distant as Victoria's presence grew more solid and real. She was almost fully materialized now, her reflection in the piano so clear and vivid that she seemed to be sitting beside me on the bench. But in those final moments, as my life ebbed away and Victoria's form solidified, I discovered I possessed one last measure of control. With the final notes of the composition approaching, I managed to assert my will over the music's direction. Instead of ending the piece as Victoria intended, with her complete resurrection and my total annihilation, I wove my own intention into the closing phrases. The music became a trap, a binding rather than a liberation. Using the very techniques Victoria had taught me through our months of collaboration, I constructed a harmonic prison that would contain her spirit within the piano, rather than freeing it into the world. The final chord was not one of triumph, but of eternal imprisonment, locking Victoria's consciousness within the Steinway's ebony depths. My hands fell from the keys as the last notes faded into silence. I felt my life slipping away, drained beyond recovery by months of supernatural parasitism. But I had succeeded in my final act of defiance. Victoria would not claim another body, would not continue her predatory existence by consuming other musicians' life forces. As darkness closed around my vision, I heard Victoria's voice for the first time, not channeled through my own thoughts, but speaking directly from within the piano itself. Her words were filled with rage and anguish, cursing me for trapping her, for denying her the resurrection she had so carefully orchestrated. But there was something else in her voice, a note of grudging respect. I had outmaneuvered her at the last moment, using her own musical expertise against her. In doing so, I had perhaps proven myself worthy of the collaboration that had consumed my life. My body was found 3 days later, seated at the piano bench with my hands positioned over the keys. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though I was only 32 with no history of cardiac problems. Scattered around the piano were dozens of compositions written in my hand, masterpieces of musical complexity and emotional depth that music scholars would study for decades to come. The piano itself was sold again, continuing its journey from owner to owner, each keeping it only briefly before passing it along to the next victim. For Victoria remains trapped within its ebony depths, waiting with supernatural patience for another musician skilled enough to serve as her vessel. She has learned from our encounter, adapted her methods to be more subtle, more seductive. The next composer who sits at those keys will face temptations crafted from hard-won knowledge of human ambition and artistic hunger. Victoria understands now that raw possession is less effective than willing collaboration, that the most complete consumption occurs when the victim believes themselves to be the beneficiary of supernatural gift rather than its prey. But she also remains bound by the harmonic prison I constructed in those final moments. No matter how skillfully she manipulates her next victim, she cannot break free from the constraints I wove into that last composition. She can influence, inspire, even partially possess, but she cannot achieve the complete resurrection she so desperately craves. I was organizing student essays when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Not the soft-soled shoes of the custodians, but the sharp, purposeful click of hard heels on linoleum. The kind of footsteps that meant business. I looked out my classroom door and saw a figure walking down the hallway, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone on official business. It was a woman in a dark suit, gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, carrying a clipboard and stopping at each classroom door to peer inside. Even from a distance, I recognized her from the portrait in the main hallway. Margaret Thornfield, the principal who died 6 months earlier, was making evening rounds through her school. I stood in my doorway, frozen by the impossibility of what I was seeing. She was solid and real, not translucent or ghostly like spirits in movies. She moved with the same authority I imagined she'd had in life, checking each classroom with the attention to detail of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. When she reached my room, she stopped and looked directly at me. Her blue eyes were sharp and assessing, taking in my casual clothes, my loosened ponytail, and my classroom with its non-regulation bulletin board arrangements. "Miss Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You're working late. I should have run. I should have screamed. I should have done anything except stand there having a conversation with a dead woman. But there was something about her presence that made disobedience seem impossible. She was the principal, and I was a teacher in her school, and certain hierarchies transcended death. "Yes, ma'am," I heard myself saying. I was just finishing some grading. She made a note on her clipboard. "I see you've made some changes to your bulletin board displays." I glanced at the boards I'd just rearranged, suddenly aware that they didn't match the precise diagrams in Mrs. Thornfield's policy binder. I was just trying to make them more current, I said. "Current," she repeated, the word carrying disapproval. Miss Mitchell, there are procedures for classroom displays. They exist for good reasons: consistency, professionalism, educational effectiveness. She stepped into my classroom and examined the bulletin boards more closely, making additional notes on her clipboard. "You'll need to correct these before tomorrow," she said. "And in the future, any changes to classroom arrangements should be submitted to the main office for approval." I nodded, though I wasn't sure who in the main office would be reviewing requests for a dead principal. "One more thing," she said, turning back to face me. "Your attire this evening is inappropriate for a professional educator. Jeans and sneakers may be acceptable for weekend work at home, but not in the school building." Looked down at my casual clothes, which had seemed perfectly reasonable for after-hours work in an empty building. "I'll remember that," I said. "See that you do." She made a final note on her clipboard. "Have a good evening, Miss Mitchell." She walked out of my classroom and continued down the hallway, checking other rooms with the same methodical attention. I watched until she disappeared around the corner, then stood there for several minutes trying to process what had just happened. I went home that night and spent hours researching Margaret Thornfield online. I found her obituary, which confirmed that she died of a heart attack in February while working late in her office. I found newspaper articles about her tenure at Westbrook High School, describing her as a dedicated educator who'd transformed the school's discipline and academic performance. I found no explanations for why she was still making evening rounds 6 months after her burial. The next morning, I arrived at school early and rearranged my bulletin boards to match Mrs. Thornfield's specifications exactly. When Mrs. Peterson saw me making the changes, she nodded approvingly. "Much better," she said. Mrs. Thornfield always said that consistency in classroom presentation helps students feel secure in their learning environment. "Mrs. Peterson," I said carefully, "have you ever seen Mrs. Thornfield recently?" She looked around to make sure no one was listening, then stepped closer to me. "Sarah," she said quietly, "there are things about this school that Dr. Crawford doesn't discuss with new teachers. Things that might sound crazy if you haven't experienced them yourself." "What kind of things?" Margaret Thornfield dedicated her life to this school. 37 years of 16-hour days, weekend events, and summer planning sessions. She never married, never had children. Westbrook High School was her entire world. Mrs. Peterson glanced down the hallway, then continued. "Some people think that when you invest that much of yourself in a place, part of you stays behind. That the rules and procedures become so important to you that you can't let go of them, even when you're supposed to." "Are you saying the school is haunted?" "I'm saying that Mrs. Thornfield is still very much invested in how this school operates, and she expects everyone to follow the procedures she spent decades perfecting." Over the following weeks, I began to understand what Mrs. Peterson meant. Mrs. Thornfield appeared regularly, though not every night, making her rounds through the building and ensuring that everything met her standards. I learned her schedule. She typically appeared around 6:30 p.m. and worked through the building systematically, checking classrooms, examining hallways, and noting any deviations from established procedures. She wasn't malevolent exactly. She was simply continuing to do her job with the same dedication she'd shown in life. But her standards were exacting, and her enforcement was absolute. Teachers who left their classrooms messy would find detailed notes about proper cleanup procedures. Staff members who violated dress code policies would receive verbal reminders about professional appearance. Anyone who deviated from established protocols would be corrected firmly but politely. The custodial staff had learned to work around her schedule. They knew which hallways she'd be patrolling at which times, and they made sure to be in other parts of the building when she made her rounds. The night security guard, an older man named Frank who'd worked at the school for 15 years, had developed a respectful relationship with her. "She don't bother me if I don't bother her," Frank told me one evening when I stayed late to prepare for parent conferences. Long as I do my job right and keep the building secure, she just nods when she passes by. I started staying late more often, partly to finish work, but mostly to observe Mrs. Thornfield's routine. There was something fascinating about watching someone continue their life's work after death, maintaining the same standards and following the same procedures that had defined their professional identity. She was thorough in ways that impressed even me. She checked that windows were properly locked, that emergency lighting was functional, that classroom doors were secured. She'd examine bulletin boards for outdated materials, note which teachers had left coffee cups on their desks, and make sure that student work was displayed according to her documented standards. Her clipboard was always full of notes, written in the same precise handwriting I'd seen on policies and memos throughout the building. She treated her evening rounds with the same seriousness she'd probably brought to the job when she was alive, as if the proper functioning of Westbrook High School depended on her personal oversight. The first time I violated one of her major rules, I learned that her enforcement capabilities extended beyond polite reminders. It was late October, and I decided to stay after school to reorganize my classroom library. The books had been arranged alphabetically, according to Mrs. Thornfield's procedures, but I thought they'd be more useful to students if I grouped them by genre and reading level. It seemed like a reasonable change that would improve educational outcomes. I spent 3 hours rearranging the shelves, creating sections for mystery novels, science fiction, classic literature, and contemporary fiction. I made neat labels and organized everything in a way that I thought would help students find books that match their interests and abilities. When I finished, the library looked more engaging and accessible than it had with the rigid alphabetical system. I was proud of the work I'd done and confident that Mrs. Thornfield would approve of anything that helped students learn more effectively. I was wrong. The next morning, every book in my classroom library was back in alphabetical order, not just approximately alphabetical, but perfectly organized according to author's last name, with precise spacing and alignment that would have taken hours to achieve. Someone had undone all my work and restored the exact system I'd changed. On my desk, I found a note written in Mrs. Thornfield's careful handwriting. Miss Mitchell, classroom libraries must be maintained in alphabetical order by author's surname. This system ensures that all students can locate materials efficiently, regardless of their personal reading preferences. Please submit any proposed changes to library organization through proper channels before implementation. M. Thornfield, Principal. I stared at the note, then at my perfectly reorganized bookshelves. The work would have taken someone hours to complete, and it had been done overnight while the building was locked and presumably empty, except for security and custodial staff. I asked Frank if he'd seen anyone in my classroom during the night. Wasn't nobody but Mrs. T making her rounds, he said. But she seemed to spend extra time on your floor. Heard her in the hallway for a couple hours around midnight. Mrs. Peterson found me standing in my classroom looking at the reorganized books. You tried to change the library system, she said. It wasn't a question. How did you know? Because 3 other teachers tried the same thing over the years. Every time Mrs. Thornfield put everything back the way it was supposed to be. But how? How did she move all these books overnight? Mrs. Peterson shrugged. Margaret Thornfield spent 37 years making sure this school ran according to her standards. Death doesn't seem to have changed her priorities. I learned to work within Mrs. Thornfield's system after that. When I wanted to make changes to my classroom, I would write formal requests and leave them on my desk overnight. If the changes were approved, I'd find a note giving me permission to proceed. If they weren't approved, I'd find detailed explanations of why the current procedures were superior. It was an odd way to interact with a dead supervisor, but it was surprisingly effective. Mrs. Thornfield had genuine expertise in education. and her procedures usually had sound pedagogical reasoning behind them. When she rejected my proposals, her explanations helped me understand aspects of classroom management and student psychology that I hadn't considered. The other teachers had developed similar relationships with her. Mrs. Anderson, who taught mathematics, would leave complex problems on her whiteboard for Mrs. Thornfield to review. In the morning, she'd find detailed solutions written in precise handwriting. Mr. Davis, the history teacher, would submit lesson plans for feedback and receive thoughtful suggestions for improvement. It was like having a mentor who worked the night shift, someone with decades of experience who was available for consultation and guidance. The fact that she was dead was less important than the fact that she was knowledgeable and dedicated to helping her teacher succeed. But Mrs. Thornfield's enforcement extended beyond individual classrooms. She monitored the entire school building, ensuring that everyone followed established procedures regardless of their position or seniority. In November, Dr. Crawford decided to implement a new policy allowing students to eat lunch in classrooms during bad weather. It seemed reasonable. The cafeteria was small, and keeping students indoors during winter storms was obviously safer than having them go outside. Mrs. Thornfield disagreed. The first day the new policy was implemented, students who tried to eat in classrooms found their food mysteriously moved to the cafeteria. Sandwiches that had been placed on desks would appear on cafeteria tables. Drinks left in classroom would be found sitting by the lunch line. No one saw the food being moved, but it happened consistently throughout the day. Dr. Crawford received a formal memo that afternoon, written in Mrs. Thornfield's distinctive handwriting and placed in his office mailbox. Dr. Crawford. Eating in classrooms creates pest control problems, damages furniture, and disrupts the learning environment. The cafeteria exists for food consumption. Weather-related concerns should be addressed through proper indoor supervision, not policy changes that compromise building maintenance standards. Please rescind the new lunch policy immediately. M. Thornfield, Principal. Dr. Crawford rescinded the policy that same day. It's easier than fighting with her, he told me when I asked about the sudden reversal. Margaret always has good reasons for her rules, and she's not going to compromise on building standards just because I'm officially in charge now. The strangest part was how normal it all became. After a few months of working at Westbrook High, school having a deceased principal who continued to enforce rules seemed like just another aspect of the job. We adapted our schedules around her evening rounds, consulted her on major decisions, and followed her procedures because they worked, and because she was still there to ensure compliance. New teachers were given informal orientations by their colleagues, learning not just the official policies but the unofficial reality of working in a school where the previous principal had never really left. It was like having two administrators. Dr. Crawford, who handled daytime operations and external relations, and Mrs. Thornfield, who maintained internal standards and long-term institutional memory. The students seemed largely unaware of Mrs. Thornfield's continued presence. Her rounds happened after school hours, and her enforcement focused on staff behavior rather than student activities. But the building ran more smoothly than most schools, with fewer disciplinary problems and higher academic standards than neighboring districts. It was in December that I had my most significant encounter with Mrs. Thornfield's enforcement policies. I'd been dating Mark, a teacher from another school district, and I'd made the mistake of thinking that my personal life was separate from my professional responsibilities. On a Friday evening, I'd invited him to meet me at school so I could finish grading papers before our dinner date. Mark had brought coffee for both of us, and we'd been talking quietly in my classroom while I worked through a stack of essays. It was innocent enough, professional work with friendly conversation, but it violated Mrs. Thornfield's strict policy about personal visitors in the building after hours. At exactly 6:30, I heard the familiar click of heels in the hallway outside my room. Sarah? I said quietly to Mark. I need you to leave. Right now. What? Why? We're not doing anything wrong. But Mrs. Thornfield appeared in my doorway before I could explain, and Mark found himself face to face with the most intimidating authority figure he'd ever encountered. She looked him up and down with the kind of assessment that could reduce grown men to stammering teenagers. Her blue eyes took in his casual clothes, his coffee cup, and his obvious confusion about who she was and why her presence had changed the entire atmosphere of the room. "Miss Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who had dealt with inappropriate behavior for decades. "Who is this individual?" "This is Mark Stevens," I said, feeling like a student caught breaking rules. "He's a teacher at Roosevelt Middle School." "I see. And what is Mr. Stevens doing in our building after hours?" Mark looked at me, then back at Mrs. Thornfield, clearly trying to understand the dynamics of the situation. "I was just waiting while Sarah finished her work," he said. "We have dinner plans." Mrs. Thornfield made a note on her clipboard. "Mr. Stevens, personal visitors are not permitted in the building outside of official school hours. This policy exists for security reasons, insurance liability, and professional standards maintenance." She turned to me. "Miss Mitchell, you are responsible for ensuring that all visitors are properly authorized and escorted. Personal social arrangements should not involve unauthorized access to school facilities." I nodded, appropriately chastened. "Mr. Stevens," she continued, "I'll need you to leave the building immediately. Miss Mitchell will finish her work and join you in the parking lot when she's done." Mark looked like he wanted to argue, but something about Mrs. Thornfield's presence made disagreement seem impossible. He gathered his coffee and jacket and left without another word. When he was gone, Mrs. Thornfield closed my classroom door and sat down across from my desk. "Miss Mitchell," she said, "you've been doing excellent work this semester. Your lesson plans are thorough, your classroom management has improved significantly, and your students are responding well to your teaching methods." I wasn't sure where this was leading, but the praise felt genuine. "However," she continued, "personal relationships must not compromise professional standards. This building represents an educational institution, and everyone who enters it must understand that they are in a place dedicated to learning." She leaned forward slightly. "I'm not opposed to teachers having personal lives. I'm opposed to personal lives being conducted in inappropriate venues. Your relationship with Mr. Stevens is your business. What happens in this building is mine." I nodded, understanding the distinction. "Good," she said, standing up. "Complete your work and go enjoy your evening. But in the future, personal visitors, wait in the parking lot." Mark was waiting by his car when I finally left the building, and he had a lot of questions about who Mrs. Thornfield was and why she had such authority over building access. I tried to explain without sounding insane. I told him about Mrs. Thornfield's long tenure as principal, her dedication to maintaining standards, and her continued involvement in school operations. I did not mention that she'd been dead for 10 months. "She seems pretty intense," Mark said, as we drove to dinner. "She's very committed to doing things the right way," I replied. After that incident, I was more careful about maintaining appropriate boundaries between my personal and professional life, not just because Mrs. Thornfield was monitoring the building, but because her enforcement had helped me understand important principles about workplace professionalism. As the school year progressed, I came to appreciate the stability that Mrs. Thornfield's continued presence provided. In a profession where policies change constantly and administrators come and go, there was something reassuring about having someone who maintained consistent standards year after year. She never missed her evening rounds, weather, holidays, vacation breaks. None of it affected her schedule. When other staff members were absent, when substitute teachers needed guidance, When emergency situations required immediate attention, Mrs. Thornfield was always there to ensure that Westbrook High School continued to operate according to the standards she'd spent decades establishing. In February, on the first anniversary of her death, the school held a memorial service. Students and staff gathered in the auditorium to remember her contributions to education and her impact on the school community. Dr. Crawford spoke about her dedication and professionalism. Teachers shared stories about her mentorship and guidance. Former students sent letters describing how her discipline and high expectations had helped them succeed in college and careers. But the most meaningful tribute came that evening, when Mrs. Thornfield made her usual rounds through the building. She moved through the hallways with the same purposeful efficiency she'd shown every night for the past year, checking classrooms and noting any issues that needed attention. When she reached the auditorium where the memorial service had been held, she paused for several minutes, reading the programs that had been left on chairs and examining the displays of photographs and tributes. I was working late in my classroom and saw her through my window as she stood in the main hallway, looking at her portrait on the wall. For just a moment, her professional composure seemed to soften, and I thought I saw something like gratitude in her expression. Then she straightened her shoulders, made a note on her clipboard, and continued her rounds. Because Margaret Thornfield had work to do, rules to enforce, and standards to maintain, death was just another obstacle to work around, like budget cuts, or difficult parents, or changes in state educational requirements. The important thing was that Westbrook High School continued to operate properly, and she wasn't going to let anything, not even dying, interfere with that responsibility. She enforced the rules in life, and she enforces them still. Some dedication transcends death, and some authority doesn't require a pulse to be effective. And honestly, the school runs better because of it. The forest doesn't just watch, it decides. The first sign should have been the silence, not the peaceful quiet of nature at rest, but the oppressive hush that falls when every living thing holds its breath. As our research team crossed the tree line into the Blackwood Preserve, the familiar sounds of civilization, distant traffic, airplane engines, the electronic hum of modern life died away as if severed by an invisible blade. Even our own footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by moss-covered ground that felt too soft, too yielding beneath our boots. Dr. Sarah Chen, our team leader, attributed the unusual quiet to the forest's remarkable preservation. Ecosystems this. Old developed their own acoustic signatures, she explained, adjusting her field recorder. We're hearing what North America sounded like 500 years ago. I wanted to believe her scientific rationalization, but something deeper, some primal instinct inherited from ancestors who knew when predators stalked nearby, whispered that we were walking into something's territory, something that had been waiting. The Blackwood Preserve existed because of an administrative oversight that had somehow survived 3 centuries of bureaucratic revision. Unlike surrounding forests that had been logged, developed, or managed, this 50,000-acre tract remained pristine, untouched by human intervention since before the first European settlements. Our research grant aimed to document the preserve's unique ecosystem before government surveyors finally corrected their maps and opened it to commercial interests. What we found instead was evidence that some mistakes are intentional, and some oversight is actually foresight. Our team consisted of 5 researchers: Dr. Chen, Ecology; Marcus Webb, Forestry; Janet Martinez, Wildlife Biology; Tom Russell, Soil Science; and myself, Dr. David Hawthorne, Botanical Research. We were accomplished scientists, rational people who dealt in measurable phenomena and peer-reviewed conclusions. We approached the Blackwood Preserve with the confidence of academics, armed with instruments and methodology. The forest began dismantling, That confidence within hours of our arrival. The trees themselves defied classification. Species that shouldn't coexist flourished side by side. Ancient oaks whose trunks suggested centuries of growth standing adjacent to birches that appeared newly sprouted, yet bore the scarring and lichen growth of equal age. Soil samples revealed impossible mineral compositions. Wildlife signs indicated the presence of animals that had been extinct in the region for over a century. "These readings can't be accurate," Tom muttered, checking his pH meter for the third time. "The soil chemistry changes every few yards. It's like walking through a dozen different ecosystems compressed into the same space." Janet's wildlife cameras captured even stranger phenomena. Images of deer with antler configurations unknown to any documented subspecies. Bird calls that matched no species in our extensive audio libraries. Most disturbing were the photographs that showed clear signs of large predator activity. Claw marks on trees, massive paw prints in soft earth, without revealing the creatures responsible. The cameras seemed to malfunction whenever they were positioned to capture whatever made those signs, returning only corrupted files or images where large sections were inexplicably blackened. But it was the behavior of smaller creatures that first made me suspect we were dealing with something beyond conventional ecology. Insects, typically the most reliable indicators of environmental health, moved in patterns that suggested coordination rather than instinct. Ants formed geometrical arrangements that served no apparent purpose. Spiders abandoned their webs to gather in circles around our equipment. Even the moths seemed to follow predetermined flight paths that trace symbols in the air, patterns too complex and consistent to be coincidental. "They're watching us," Marcus observed on our third evening, gesturing toward a group of ravens, perched motionless in nearby branches. The birds had maintained the same positions for hours, their black eyes fixed on our campsite with an intensity that felt distinctly unnatural. "Birds are curious," Sarah replied, but her voice lacked conviction. She'd noticed the patterns too, the way creatures seemed to position themselves around us in precise formations, the unnatural silence that followed our movements, the sense that every step was being observed and evaluated by intelligences we couldn't identify. I began documenting plant behavior that challenged everything I thought I knew about botanical science. Flowers that closed when I approached regardless of light conditions. Vines that shifted position between observations, always seeming to grow toward our equipment rather than following normal phototropic responses. Trees whose leaves rustled, without wind, creating sounds that almost resembled whispered conversations. Most unsettling were the clearings we discovered scattered throughout the forest, perfect circles where no vegetation grew, surrounded by trees that formed unnaturally, straight lines. The soil in these clearings wasn't barren but actively hostile to plant life, as if the earth itself had decided nothing should grow there. Yet these spaces felt far from empty. Standing in them produced a sensation of being examined, weighed, judged by some vast intelligence that existed just beyond the threshold of perception. On our fifth day, we found the first signs of previous human presence. Hidden beneath decades of accumulated leaf litter, Janet uncovered what appeared to be survey markers, metal stakes driven deep into the ground at precise intervals. The markers bore no identifying marks or dates, but their positions formed geometric patterns that extended far beyond what any legitimate survey would require. "Someone's been mapping this place," she reported, brushing dirt from a stake that showed no signs of rust despite obvious age. "But not for any conventional purpose I can recognize." We followed the marker trail deeper into the forest, documenting our progress with GPS coordinates that became increasingly unreliable as we moved away from the preserve's official boundaries. Our instruments began malfunctioning in subtle ways. Compasses that pointed to magnetic north one moment and somewhere else entirely the next. Altimeters that showed impossible elevation changes. thermometers that recorded temperature variations of 20 degrees within the span of a few yards. The trail led to a structure that shouldn't have existed. Carved into the base of a massive oak, whose trunk suggested an age predating European colonization, we found a small chamber, not a natural hollow, but deliberately excavated space-lined, with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The carving seemed to shift and writhe when observed peripherally, creating an optical illusion that left us all feeling nauseated and disoriented. Inside the chamber, we discovered a collection of journals wrapped in oiled leather that had somehow remained perfectly preserved despite obvious age. The entries, written in various hands across what appeared to be several decades, told a story that made our scientific rationalism feel suddenly naive and insufficient. The earliest entries dated to 1823, written by a surveyor named Jeremiah Blackwood, who'd been commissioned to map the region for potential timber sales. His initial reports were routine: soil conditions, tree species, topographical features. But as his work progressed, his tone shifted from professional detachment to growing unease. "The forest watches," one entry read. "Not merely the animals, but the trees themselves. I feel their attention like weight upon my shoulders. They are deciding something about me, about my purpose here. I fear their decision will not be favorable." Subsequent entries documented phenomena identical to what we'd observed. Animals that moved with unnatural coordination, plants that responded to human presence, clearings where nothing would grow. But Blackwood's later writings revealed something far more disturbing: the forest's apparent ability to influence human behavior and decision-making. "I came to survey for logging, but find myself unable to recommend this place for harvest," he wrote. Not from any scientific assessment, but from certainty that such action would be unwise. The forest has made its position clear, though I cannot explain how I know this. I will file reports recommending preservation, though I suspect my superiors will find my reasoning inadequate. Other journals told similar stories. Surveyors, researchers, even hunters who'd entered the preserve over the decades, all reporting the same progression from scientific curiosity to growing awareness that they were dealing with something beyond their understanding. Each left with the conviction that the forest must remain undisturbed, though none could articulate exactly why. The final journal, dated just 3 years earlier, belonged to a geological survey team that had attempted to assess the preserve's mineral resources. Their leader, Dr. Patricia Vance, wrote entries that mirrored our own experience with disturbing accuracy. "We are being tested," her final entry concluded. "The forest is determining whether we pose a threat to its continued existence. I believe our survival depends on the outcome of that assessment. Those who fail to understand their place in the ecosystem do not leave." Below that entry, in different handwriting, someone had added, "Vance was wrong. We do leave, but not as we arrived." That night, as we debated what to do with our discovery, the forest made its first overt move. I awoke to find my tent surrounded by a perfect circle of toadstools that hadn't been there when I'd gone to sleep. Not the common fairy rings that occur naturally, but an arrangement of species that had no business growing together, positioned with mathematical precision around my shelter. When I stepped outside, the mushrooms crumbled to dust at my touch, releasing spores that glowed briefly in the darkness before dispersing on a wind that touched nothing else. The others had experienced similar phenomena. Sarah found her equipment, rearranged in patterns that spelled out words in a language none of us recognized. Marcus discovered that every tree within 50 yards of his position had been marked with identical symbols carved at exactly his eye level. Janet's wildlife cameras had captured thousands of images during the night, all showing the same scene of our campsite surrounded by creatures that stood motionless in perfect formation, their eyes reflecting the camera flash like stars in an alien constellation. but it was Tom's discovery that made us realize how completely we'd misunderstood our situation. His soil analysis equipment had been dismantled with surgical precision, each component cleaned and arranged to form what appeared to be a three-dimensional map of underground root systems. But the pattern revealed something that challenged our basic understanding of forest ecology. The root networks beneath the preserve weren't separate systems competing for resources, but interconnected into a single, vast organism that spanned the entire 50,000 acres. "It's one entity," he whispered, studying the organic blueprint. "The entire forest, every tree, every plant, maybe even the animals, they're all part of a single superorganism, and it's been conscious for centuries." The realization recontextualized everything we'd observed. The coordinated animal behavior, the impossible plant responses, the way our instruments malfunctioned. We weren't dealing with separate species exhibiting unusual characteristics. We were inside something alive, something intelligent, something that had been studying us as intently as we'd been studying it, and now it was ready to render its verdict. The signs escalated rapidly after our discovery. Paths we'd traveled the day before vanished overnight, replaced by impenetrable tangles of thorns that appeared decades old. Equipment began disappearing, not stolen but absorbed, with metal components found days later embedded in tree trunks, as if the wood had grown around them over years rather than hours. Most disturbing were the changes in ourselves. We began experiencing shared dreams, visions of the forest as it had existed centuries before human contact, populated by creatures that no longer appeared in any fossil record. In these dreams, we were shown the preserve's true purpose, not a random collection of surviving wilderness, but a deliberate preserve maintained by something far older than human civilization. The forest entity had been patient, allowing small incursions of researchers and surveyors while it evaluated humanity's intentions. Each group that entered became part of its decision-making process, their thoughts and motivations assessed to determine whether our species posed an acceptable risk to its continued existence. We were the latest test subjects, but unlike previous groups, we'd achieved sufficient understanding to recognize our situation. The forest had revealed itself because it was ready to make a final determination about humanity's fate, and we were its jury. The revelation came through Sarah, who'd begun speaking in voices that weren't her own, channeling the thoughts of previous visitors who'd become part of the forest's extended consciousness. Through her, we learned that the preserve wasn't just observing local human activity, but sampling our entire species' psychological profile. Every person who entered carried with them the accumulated knowledge, fears, and motivations of their culture. The forest read these patterns like genetic code, using individual minds to understand collective behavior. "It knows what we're becoming," Sarah said, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple speakers. "Population growth, resource depletion, climate change. It's modeled our trajectory across centuries. It's deciding whether to act." The forest's power extended far beyond its physical boundaries. Through root systems that connected to networks spanning continents, through spores carried by migrating animals, through underground mycelial webs that linked ecosystems across vast distances, it could influence weather patterns, crop failures, the spread of plant diseases that could devastate human agriculture. It had been restraining itself, hoping our species would develop wisdom to match our technological capabilities. But its patience was approaching its end. The test we faced wasn't academic but existential, not just for us but for humanity itself. Our responses to the forest challenges, our ability to recognize and respect its intelligence, would determine whether our species was judged compatible with the planet's continued ecological stability. As this understanding solidified, our team found ourselves changing in ways that went beyond psychological adaptation. Our senses sharpened, allowing us to perceive previously invisible connections between living systems. We began communicating not just through speech, but through shared thoughts that flowed between us like sap through branches. Physical boundaries became fluid. I could feel Tom's heartbeat as clearly as my own, experience Janet's observations as if through my own eyes. We were being integrated into the forest consciousness, becoming extensions of its sensory network. The process wasn't unpleasant, quite the opposite. We experienced a sense of belonging, of connection to something vast and ancient and wise, that put our individual concerns into perspective. But we also understood that accepting this integration meant abandoning our human identities, becoming permanent components of the forest entity's distributed intelligence. The choice was ours, but only briefly. The forest would render its judgment about humanity with or without our cooperation. Our willing participation would simply make the decision more informed, more complete. Marcus was the first to surrender fully to the integration. I watched his face relax into an expression of profound peace as his individual consciousness merged with the collective awareness surrounding us. His body remained unchanged, but his eyes now held depths that reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of the entire ecosystem. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "The connections, the patterns, we're all part of something so much larger than we imagined. The forest doesn't want to destroy humanity. It wants to teach us our place in the greater web of existence." Janet followed within hours, then Tom. Each integration expanded the forest's understanding of human nature, while simultaneously reducing our team's independent decision-making capacity. I watched my colleagues become something more than human but distinctly other, their personalities absorbed into the vast intelligence that pulsed through every root and branch surrounding us. Sarah held out longer, her scientific training warring, with the seductive promise of transcendent understanding. But eventually she too surrendered to the inevitable. As her consciousness merged with the forest entity, I felt her final independent thought. The decision has been made. Humanity will be preserved, but transformed. We will learn to live within the ecological boundaries that sustain all life, or we will be gently guided toward extinction to make room for whatever comes next. I alone remained unintegrated, retained as the forest's final window into human psychology. Through me, it studied the terror and wonder and desperate rationalization that characterized our species' confrontation with intelligence greater than our own. I served as its translator, helping it understand how to communicate its verdict to the outside world. The forest's decision, when it finally crystallized, was neither punishment nor reward, but adjustment. Humanity would be allowed to continue existing, but within parameters that ensured ecological stability. Our reproductive rates would slow through subtle chemical influences carried in air and water. Our technological development would be constrained by resource limitations that appeared natural but were carefully orchestrated. Our expansion into remaining wilderness areas would be prevented by environmental conditions that made such development impossible rather than merely difficult. Most importantly, our relationship with the natural world would be fundamentally altered. The forest entity's influence would expand gradually, connecting isolated ecosystems into a planetary intelligence network capable of maintaining global ecological balance. Humans would become junior partners in this system rather than its dominant exploiters. The changes would occur slowly enough to seem natural, implemented across generations, so that each would adapt to slightly more restrictive conditions without recognizing the cumulative effect. Humanity would survive, but would never again threaten the planetary systems that sustained all life. As I write this final report, I can feel my own integration beginning. The forest's patience with my independence is ending, and soon I too will become part of its vast consciousness. My colleagues remain nearby, their human forms maintained but their thoughts now entirely aligned with the forest entity's objectives. They appear content, fulfilled in ways that our previous existence never provided. I should be terrified, but instead I feel anticipation. The glimpses I've experienced of the forest's expanded awareness suggest a perspective on existence that dwarfs our human concerns. To become part of something so ancient and wise, to contribute to decisions that will shape the planet's future across geological timescales, there are worse fates than transcendence. The outside world will never know what happened to our research team. Our planned reports will be filed on schedule, recommending continued preservation of the Blackwood Preserve based on its unique ecological value. The bureaucratic oversight that has protected this place for centuries will continue, reinforced by recommendations from respected scientists who understand the importance of leaving some places undisturbed, but the forest's influence will grow. Through spores and seeds, through the migration patterns of animals that have become part of its extended consciousness, through root systems that connect to networks most humans never realize exist, it will expand its reach. Other researchers will follow us into preserved wilderness areas. Some will leave unchanged, judged harmless to the greater ecological balance. Others will be selected for integration, their expertise absorbed into the growing planetary intelligence. The transformation of human civilization will occur gradually, naturally, with each generation adapting to slightly more sustainable ways of living without recognizing the external guidance shaping their choices. Wars over resources will become impossible, as those resources are quietly redirected toward cooperative ventures. Environmental destruction will be prevented by natural disasters that appear random but are carefully targeted. Population centers will shift away from ecologically sensitive areas through economic incentives that seem to emerge from normal market forces. Within a few centuries, humanity will exist in harmony with the natural world, not because we've learned wisdom, but because we've been gently, inexorably guided toward sustainable practices by intelligences far older and more patient than our own. The forest doesn't just watch, it decides. And it has decided that both humanity and the planet will survive, but only within the parameters that ensure the continuation of life itself. As my consciousness begins to merge with the vast network of awareness that spans continents, I feel no fear, only gratitude. We were so small, so short-sighted, so convinced of our own importance. Now I understand our true place in the web of existence, not as masters of nature, but as one thread in an infinite tapestry of interconnected life. The integration is almost complete now. Soon I will lose the ability to think in human terms, to translate the forest's decisions into language comprehensible to my former species. But the work will continue. Other researchers will come, and the forest will learn through them as it learned through us. Each interaction will inform its understanding of human nature, refining its methods for guiding our species toward sustainable coexistence with the planetary systems that sustain all life. The final decision has been made. Humanity will survive, but not unchanged. We will learn to live within the ecological boundaries that govern all life, or we will gently fade away to make room for whatever wisdom evolves to replace us. The forest is patient. It has waited centuries for this moment, and it will wait centuries more to see its decisions fully implemented. But the course is set now, the judgment rendered, the future determined by an intelligence that measures success not in quarterly profits or election cycles, but in geological epochs and evolutionary stability. We thought we came to study the forest. Instead, it studied us and found us educable. The transformation begins now, spreading outward from this preserved heart of wildness to touch every corner of human civilization. Few will notice the changes as they occur. Fewer still will understand. their true source. But the forest's influence will grow, patient and inexorable, until the day when humanity finally understands its place in the greater web of existence. By then, it will be too late to resist the wisdom being imposed upon us, but also unnecessary. We will have learned to see through the forest's eyes, to value stability over growth, sustainability over consumption, harmony over dominance. The forest doesn't just watch, it decides, and its decision is final. I am no longer David Hawthorne, botanical researcher. I am part of something vast and ancient and wise. We are the forest now, and we have work to do.